Welcome back to the night shift. Occasionally, someone will approach me, usually a concerned friend, colleague, or family member, and look me in the eye and ask, what is it about this UFO thing? Like, why are you so into this? It's like an obsession. And I think at bottom, it's because ufology, or just the study of anything related to the UFO phenomenon, leads you down a rabbit hole. And at the bottom of that rabbit hole, you know what you find? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of very, very credible people saying absolutely batshit incredible things. And if even 1% of what these people are saying turns out to be true, it not only means that the world is completely different than what we have been taught, it opens up the possibility for so much, for us to completely transform the way that we live on this planet, both in a physical sense, spiritual sense, culturally. It would give us an opportunity to stop the crazy train that we're on as a species. And it might be a big enough existential shock that it would snap us out of this collective psychosis. So for me, if you think about how many credible people have said so many incredible things, and then you just assume that some of this has to be true, you don't even have to get specific about what's actually true, but just some of it, then that's amazing. Like, that's worth talking about. That's worth looking at. That's worth paying attention to. I'm talking presidents, astronauts, engineers, scientists, regular people, educated, rich, poor, across all social strata, all walks of life, for centuries have reported seeing crazy, crazy things. I feel like sometimes I've slipped into an alternative parallel timeline where, like, this is the sci-fi timeline and I'm in the UFO expanded universe, like, expansion pack. And then there's like the AI expansion pack. And as all these things are going on, like, the science fiction world that I was exposed to in science fiction as a child in the 80s and 90s is happening and becoming real all around, like, minute by minute now. Almost like every week there's some new, amazing, jaw-dropping discovery. So the UFO conversation, as just part of all of that, or happening in tandem with all of these other things, is just one really fascinating area. And I find it to be unbelievably addictive, because some of it's real, some of it's made up, some of it is lore that's just been built up over decades and decades. Some of it is clearly misinformation or disinformation. But because we can't really suss out what is what, it's just this gigantic soup of science fiction sounding stuff. And that's fun. That's just what it is. In the study of ufology, a big corner of it is set aside for what people call the abduction scenario, the abduction experience, or some other people. There's some argument about that term because it has some negative implications. But broadly speaking, some people claim that they have been abducted against their will, out of their home, out of their car, off the street sometimes. It can sometimes be from their job. It doesn't matter where, taken or lured onto a craft against their will, where they are either experimented on, tests are run on them, or some other activity takes place that is outside of what we would consider anything normal. And these people who claim to have been on board, some claim to have been on board craft, many, and others aren't so sure. They suggest that they may have been in some kind of subterranean cavern. Sometimes you hear that, or some other place that isn't necessarily a spaceship. And it gets even more confusing because apparently, if you read enough of these cases, it's widely enough mentioned that the beings, the non-human intelligences that these people are interacting with, have the capacity to influence the way we think, or project an image into your mind and make you think you're seeing something that may not actually be there. Sort of like the holodeck on Star Trek, but maybe individualized so that three people standing next to each other could each be seeing three completely different things. That seems to be common enough that there's some kind of a there. But the study of abductions, and other people do claim that they have benign contact, of course, and there are many stories of benign contact or just that don't have that abduction aspect to them. So I'm not trying to paint everything with a super broad brush. I'm just talking about people being brought on board craft, and some of those people are taken against their will. And there's enough people that claim that that has happened to them that I think it's worth looking at. John Mack, the head of psychiatry at Harvard University, also thought it was worth looking at. And he wrote a book called Abduction. We're going to look at some clips from John and some other people that were looking at this at the time that this book came out. He's probably one of the biggest names that leaps to mind in the study of abductions. But Bud Hopkins is another.
The first thing is that the aliens are extraordinarily deceptive and operate in a covert manner. There was no doubt about that. There's no possible way that anyone who's looked into this phenomenon can say anything to the contrary of that, simply because we have a whole history of what we have to call screen memories, when the UFO occupants make us see things that are not there.
Bud Hopkins is or was an artist and UFO researcher, but importantly, not a trained mental health professional and not an expert in hypnosis. But he began doing hypnotic regression work in the 80s and 90s and tried to figure out what was happening during some of the missing time that was reported by these abductees. And actually, Bud Hopkins got in touch with John Mack, and he's the one that got John Mack interested in the subject to begin with. And John talks about that in numerous interviews. So there's an interesting relationship between these two. And as that developed and the study of abductees continued, some aspects of what was being discussed sort of got baked into the lore, and they became almost like furniture around the conversation. And things that were just assumed to be the case, even though they were based on some questionable conclusions made at a time when we really didn't know what tools to use to look at something like this. And if you think about the average, not average, but the commonly reported aspects of an alien abduction, missing time. Sometimes people will report seeing strange lights in the sky. They're approached by a light. All the sound around them goes completely silent. Insects stop making sound. The breeze stops blowing through the trees. It's almost like they're frozen in time. Then they experience missing time, and sometimes an hour, sometimes many hours. And usually when they come to, they're either in their car, in their home, wherever they were taken from, or sometimes they can be miles and miles away, sometimes with a different group of people wearing different clothes. Sometimes their clothes can be on incorrectly. Their shoes are on the wrong feet. All kinds of strange stuff happens. And then these folks will seek to figure out what happened to them. And in doing so, eventually come across Bud Hopkins or someone doing the research. And the tool that was most used in the early days was hypnosis, hypnotic regression, to put people into a relaxed mental state where they could reveal or at least see or try to recall some of what had happened during that missing time. And the trouble with that is that hypnosis is notoriously finicky and unreliable, and human memory is very fallible, unreliable. In fact, if you want to get out of jury duty, you can just tell the judge that you know how fallible human memory is, and they will throw you right out. I have done that, and I have got out of jury duty. So that's not, it's not out of the realm of possibility that these are just mental creations of people that are sort of reacting to cultural stimuli, science fiction movies, books they've read, comic books, anything like that. But it's like happens a lot, and it happens so much, and so many people have really bizarre things to say that it starts to, if you look at it long enough, it starts to feel really ominous and weird. Like you almost can't get away from the feeling that this is very real, and it's got to be happening to at least some of these people. Maybe some people are making it up, but let's be honest about that. Nobody, go back and look at interviews, like look at the Oprah Winfrey episode that she did when John Mack's book came out about abductees. And she straight up laughs at these people in front of a room filled with a live studio audience on national television. Like, these were people who were made fun of, immediately found their life thrown into chaos, harassed. It's not a good thing to come out publicly and start talking about being abducted by aliens. Like, it does you no good. No one has ever made money and gotten super rich by sharing this horrible, embarrassing experience and then publicizing it. Like, anybody who has, that's not the real deal. There's just no way. In fact, like, the whole anal probe thing, that started with Whitley Strieber, the author of Communion, way back when he first put out that book. That's one of the things very first thing that people zeroed in on was this anal probe thing. And that became South Park history and became comedy history. And it was just like baked into our culture after that. Now, you could make the case that maybe that was done to silence him. And so it was done intentionally, or it could have just been our culture trying to react to something that's very disturbing, whatever. But it's not a good career move. So the fact that people continue to come out and talk about their experiences is very interesting to me. If you're interested in, now, Hopkins and Mack looked at, they attempted to interview people and work with them in sort of a one-on-one and group basis. But sometimes it's more interesting to hear the information right from the person. And if you're interested in researching some cases like that, I highly recommend Incident at Devil's Den by Terry Lovelace. Terry was a Air Force airman who went on a camping trip with a friend of his in Devil's Den Park. And during their trip, they were witnessing some strange lights in the sky, and then the lights approached their campsite. It was some huge triangular craft that, he says, scanned the grounds with a laser, scanned them individually. They experienced missing time. They blacked out. They came to, their clothes were on wrong. Their shoes were on the wrong feet. They were disoriented. They were almost suffering from radiation burns. He kind of describes it as like they were so thirsty, they just had to get in their car, and they drove to the very first gas station. And then he talks about going inside and just buying a gigantic thing of orange cola and drinking the whole thing immediately, all the way down. And it's just a crazy story. They get back to base. They're immediately debriefed aggressively by some intelligence people, and they're separated. His friend is put on a bunch of psychiatric medication and basically turns into a vegetable. And Terry manages to sort of get out of that situation, and he goes on to be an attorney and a writer. And so this book is outstanding. Highly, highly recommended. Another really interesting case is The Keepers with Jim Sparks. This is, or by Jim Sparks. Jim Sparks is one of a very, very small minority of contact or abductees, contact experiencers, depending on which term you're comfortable with, that talk about having conscious recall of their experiences, of most, if not all, of his experiences. Meaning that typically in a common abduction scenario, the person experiences missing time. So for like 4 hours, you blink and 4 hours have gone by, and you have no way to account for what happened during that time. Jim Sparks claims that he has total memory of everything that happened to him. And in his book, he tells the story, and he does a great presentation at MUFON where he talks about this. He tells the story of how this started happening to him, and he thought he was going insane. And at one point, he was so distraught over what was happening to him that he was sleeping with a loaded revolver under his pillow. He would get in the car in the middle of the night, drive to the middle of the city, find a hotel that was a big high-rise hotel, get a room right in the middle of the hotel, because he thought if he was sandwiched and stacked in between all the other people in the building, that he would be somehow safe and they couldn't get to him. And it really drove him to the edge of madness. And he talks about in the book how through that process of dealing with this over many, many, many years, he learned to actually gain some autonomy on these trips, and they gave him a little bit more freedom. He learned some things about what at least the beings that he claims to have come in contact with were up to and why. And it turns out to not be so frightening after all. He comes to terms with it. So Jim Sparks, Terry Lovelace, two great individual cases if you're interested. If you want to get dark, Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs. This is Walking Among Us by David Jacobs. Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs take a frightening sort of view on what's happening. And they basically were the source of the original sort of mentions in popular or in our culture about hybrid children, a hybrid breeding program, reproductive type experiments. That's where all this stuff really started to get widely publicized. So it gets dark. There are people who claim that the experiences are very positive. There are people who claim they're just terrifying and they want it to stop. There are people who claim that, it started out negative and then became positive. No matter how you look at it and how you, where you come at this from, it's fascinating. It's shocking, some of these claims. I'll read one to you. This one will just blow your mind. As the being stared into her eyes, Catherine felt she had no choice but to look back. I asked what the experience was like. I think he knows everything about me. He knows exactly what I'm thinking. He's answering questions before I even think of them. As when he told her this process was necessary, quote, before I even asked. Looking into the being's eyes is, quote, scary for Catherine. But then parts of me are kind of beaten down. I feel just calm and peaceful. In addition, she felt the figure wants to know me personally. I'm trying to think, why, you don't care about me as an individual, but it's hard to think it. It's hard. It's hard to think anything that's against what he wants me to think. The being insisted, no, I want to know about you. I care about you. The struggle of wills continued. Her resistance was making him work harder than he feels like he should have to. Her mind said bullshit as the being tried to tell me that he loves me. Finally, she conceded, maybe he's right. Maybe I just don't understand. I think maybe I was wrong for thinking that he was lying. I just don't understand them. That's why I think that. She persisted with the thought that he does not know what care means, and he responded, no, we know. We just don't feel it as intensely as you do. What? Okay. What she's describing is telepathic mind control being exercised on an individual to force them to calm down and become compliant and obedient. That's terrifying. And she's not the only person. This is from Abductions. She's not the only person to say this. This happens like hundreds and hundreds of times. Like, you read enough abduction cases, this comes up again and again and again. So I'm always excited to talk to someone who takes this type of research seriously and is willing to devote their time and energy and expertise to learning more about what is going on with these cases, because they are wild. And Daniel Rekshan is just such a person. He actually reached out to me after he saw my interview with Kelly Chase a while back and expressed some concerns about some of the things that we were talking about on the show vis-a-vis the abduction phenomenon, because some of that stuff, he said, is not entirely based in reality. And I found that really interesting because I've looked at this a lot. So I reached back out to Daniel. I offered to chat with him, and we set up a time to do an interview. We just recorded it. It was great. He is a mental health expert and an author and a therapist and a dream expert and a trained hypnotist and an experiencer himself. So he can explain it a lot better than I can, but he has a different kind of idea about what may be happening with the reports of alien abductions. And it's based on dreams, but it's not what you might think. He's not suggesting that these are just dreams and that everybody's just dreaming. He's actually got a much more interesting angle on this. I'll let Daniel explain it. Let's get into the interview. But hey, before we do, if you're not already a subscriber, please hit the subscribe button. It really helps me out. It only takes a second. I'm trying to grow this channel. I'm trying to raise the level of conversation around this topic. I'm trying to bring on more and more interesting guests. And the best way for me to do that is to show that I have an audience that's not only growing, but that is engaged and interested and that is, wants to learn. So please subscribe. Please like and share this video. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being a part of Team Night Shift. Now enjoy the interview. My next guest is Daniel Rekshan. He is a experiencer and abduction researcher who actually reached out to me recently after watching the interview that I did with Kelly Chase about some of the conversation that we were having about the abduction phenomenon. And Daniel has a alternative concept of what's going on, and we got into an email exchange about it, and I find it very fascinating. I think you will too. And I'm going to introduce Daniel in just a moment, but before I do, I'll just give you a little bit of background on Daniel. D-SETI is put forth by Daniel Rekshan. He experienced contact with NHI through dreams and dedicated his career and education to studying this phenomenon. In 2009, after working with dreams in his art practice, Daniel became inspired to develop web technologies to perform massive data collection and experimentation regarding dreams. Since then, he has gained the credentials, experience, and education to lead D-SETI. Daniel, welcome to the Night Shift. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. So we've talked a little bit in advance of this interview, but for those of you who aren't familiar with you or your work, can you tell us a little bit about your background? You said you yourself are an experiencer, and what brought you into this line of research?
Yeah, absolutely. So I put forward my research through the website D-SETI.org. That's a private practice right now where I offer sessions and education regarding dream work, missing time, and hypnosis. I have a master's degree in East-West psychology, a bachelor's degree in classical liberal arts, 2 certificates in hypnosis, and I'm a PhD student in the Integral Noetic Science program at California Institute for Human Sciences. And so I'm all about studying dreams, noetic things, consciousness, to understand what's going on in the phenomena. And ultimately, the reason why I'm studying this is because of my childhood experiences of seeing figures, strange dreams. There were a lot of stories, like my dad saw a UFO come up to our house. My aunt saw like a UFO craft in a cornfield with little beings coming out of it. And she's like a conservative Christian. And so I believed her when she said she saw those things. And I had my own experiences. So sort of open to the notion that hypnosis could bring forward memories or communications or insight regarding our contact with extraterrestrials. And so from there, I sort of, did a dance of avoidance and fascination. Avoidance because it's a terrifying subject. You feel very powerless about it. It's confusing. And so I really have spent decades sort of going into this research, coming out, freaking out, then coming back in. And most recently in 2020, I went all in and I said, I have to do this. Now is the time. The 2017 New York Times article was out for like 3 years. COVID hit. It's like, why am I still working web contracts when I have 2 hypnosis certificates and this passion? And so I jumped in. I started working with experiencers and abductees and missing time people, to dozens of them, to have hypnosis sessions that I now say are more like dream work sessions than memory retrieval. And that's some of the thing I talk a lot about. And that's what ultimately brought me in conversation with you here and now.
Can you talk a little bit about, for those people who are new to this, and I think so many people have come on board since 2017, and it's such a big world. It's such a deep rabbit hole. There's so many aspects to it. The abduction phenomenon in and of itself represents a huge subcategory within the UFO research community. And for many people, in fact, probably for most people, it's where the rubber really meets the road. And these are people who, there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who have claimed to have face-to-face actual contact with these non-human intelligences. Some claim to have been brought on board craft. These would be the people who actually have real intelligence on what is on these craft, what life is like for these beings or creatures or non-human intelligences. I think the big debate around this issue seems to be, on the one hand, are they real or are they not? And if they are real, are they good or are they bad? What does this mean for us? Can you describe for the audience, from your perspective, what is the abduction phenomenon? Is there a difference? Do you draw a distinction between contact cases, abductions, experiencers? Talk to us a little bit about that from your perspective.
Yeah, so the perspective I take is one of critical literature review, which means I'm looking into this from a scholarly perspective. I've looked into it from other perspectives and I go, oh my God, contactees, they've got amazing stories. Abductees, they're terrifying. There's so much information there. And so rather than saying what the phenomena directly is saying, I'm looking to literature about the phenomena. So I'm trying to find references and citations about where do we get the term abductee? What about contactee? What does experiencer even mean? And when was it first used? And then looking at that literary information to gain insight about the phenomena. So contactee was used in the 50s and onwards. Abduction as well, the 50s, 60s, 70s has some references to it. It's only in the 80s where it starts to become this really mass market kind of thing with Bud Hopkins, who published Missing Time in 1981. And then the 80s was all about it becoming popular, people thinking about it. In 1990, abductee became almost a household name or idea with the early research with David Jacobs. He's a history professor, John Mack, a psychiatry professor, bringing these ideas about abduction forward. And that's really important in terms of the literature because before John Mack's work, we had only David Jacobs and Bud Hopkins in terms of something close to scholarly. David Jacobs is a professor. He writes in a scholarly way. And then John Mack is a psychiatrist writing in a clinical science way. So his work in the early 90s opened the door to clinical and scientific publications about abduction, which is not what we see about contactees. We don't see a lot of writing about contactees. There's this one case where anthropologists infiltrated a contactee group and saw that their predictions that the end of the world or UFO visitations didn't come true. And then later on, we have a lot more writing about contactee with the free survey, but that's in the last decade. So it's really the abductees that bring us this scientific literature. And that's why I'm looking at them. And that's why I say it's a bit different than contactee or experiencer, although now it's all kind of glommed together. And that's why I'm talking about it, because I think we need to piece apart where do we start talking about these different terms and what do they imply?
Can you talk a little bit about, for people who may not be familiar with the distinction between those terms? I mean, we've had a lot of shifting vocabulary as this field has matured, particularly in the years since 2017. We've moved away from extraterrestrials and aliens to non-human intelligence, which I think is very interesting because it is such an expansive, broad category. That could include artificial intelligence. That could include non-corporeal, energy-based intelligence. There's a lot of different things that can fall into that category. So I think that's interesting. But the terms specifically contactee, abductee, and experiencer mean different things to different people. Can you talk about what those distinctions are?
Yeah, contactee is a sense that space aliens are contacting an individual, but not necessarily perpetrating an abduction. So in the literature, we have, and this is kind of popular literature, not scientific. In the 50s, there's this, like the Space Brothers, George Adamski, there's sort of these notions that space aliens generally from our solar system are coming here to say, hey, get rid of nuclear war. We'll give you technology, peace and love. It's really great out there. That sort of thing. And so there's a lot of love and light associated with that. You get stuff like Van Tassel's Integratron kind of idea where he downloaded a blueprint of something and is trying to build it. That's contactee. In contrast, it's almost like a shift between good and dark, light, like light and dark, good or bad. There's the abductee, where that's essentially defined by being kidnapped by a space alien. There's procedures performed on a UFO craft, and the person's returned without a lot of memory. And that actually is defined in terms of dream and hypnosis. And it's in the 80s and 90s, it was really about finding an explanation for fragmentary memories that were presumed to be traumatic. And it's less about fantastic narratives of contact, which is what the Space Brothers kind of contactee thing in the 50s was about. Those were rich stories that contactees held and sort of figured out themselves or had kind of complete. The 80s and 90s brought us the hypnotists that were actively looking and going, I see a nightmarish memory here. I see a mark on the body there. Therefore, something must have happened, and we must now call that abduction.
I think one of the most obvious cases that jumps to the mind of most people who've looked into this is the Betty and Barney Hill case. Can you talk a little bit about how that would fit into what you just described?
Yeah, so Betty and Barney Hill, I believe it was like 1961 where they had an encounter. They were driving in New England at night. They saw a light. They pulled off to the side of the road. They had something happen, and then they go back. Betty was plagued by nightmares. They have an intuition something happened. Then they decided to talk to Benjamin Simon, who is a psychiatrist, then and hypnotist. They used hypnosis to understand what happened in the event of them standing outside, looking at the light, knowing something happened. They go, their emotions were high. There was an impact. There was an aftermath. There were like physical effects on the body, on a dress, on a car. So they go, we need to understand what actually happened.
And missing time, right?
Yes.
That's the thing that really most people notice is like they will leave and go someplace, and then 3 hours will pass, and the place they were supposed to get to was a 15-minute drive, and people are freaked out. So the missing time is the thing that cues most people to start looking into what's going on during that window of missing time. So what did they learn during that process?
So they had a number of hypnotic sessions with Benjamin Simon, and they learned about interactions with beings. So they had, I believe it was military men actually were there, as well as other beings that had wraparound eyes. There's some very famous elements of that experience. The wraparound eyes is important because it ties them to science fiction that came out like 11 days earlier before the hypnosis session. So skeptics talk about that a lot. Then they talk about a star map where someone figured that like Betty drew it out, and then they go, oh, this is Zeta Reticuli. So that's maybe one of the sources where we get the notion of Zeta Reticulans and things like that. So they found out stuff happened there, and the Hills say it happened. Dr. Simon says he thinks of everything after the light in the sky in the hypnosis induction as a shared dream or something like that. So that is essential. This one case is very essential because it sets up a pattern of professional hypnotists and clinically trained people supporting these abductions, saying that they think they're dreams or unable to make the determination, is it dream or real, and having the experiencers or the abduction researchers going, I'm going to ignore that clinical advice and say it's definitely an ET or space alien. How could you not, with so much evidence and things like that? So that's essential. That one case is very essential. And the hypnosis Simon did was essential because it set the pattern for every single abduction researcher afterward. The Hopkins, Jacobs, and Mack, they all looked to that case and they said, this is an example of good hypnosis. So I look to that and say, well, how did he perform hypnosis and things like that? And there's a lot of questions I have around that.
I think that's a really important aspect to this discussion because we're talking about a phenomena where we don't really have a way. I mean, we have tools to study it, but we don't know what tools are the right tools because we really don't know what we're looking at yet. And on the nuts and bolts side, we have people who claim to have worked on actual physical flying saucers that are real and solid. And that spectrum on the other end goes all the way to people who have go into trance and have channeling experiences, and it can be anything and everything in between. But I think the methodology that you just talked about is really key because this idea of using hypnosis to uncover what happened during missing time, as we are kind of figuring this all out, we know hypnosis has its own set of issues and can be problematic in many ways, but that seems to be the only tool that we have. And I think you just alluded to this a minute ago when Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, who aren't trained mental health experts, they started doing a lot of hypnosis work, and that kind of branched off into this abduction conversation that we later wound up having in the 90s. How did that timeline play out? And can you talk a little bit about how we get from Betty and Barney Hill to John Mack on Oprah Winfrey and Bud Hopkins in between, and where do these researchers? Who are these people? Who should the audience be aware of in terms of abduction research? Who are the names that people should be thinking about? And what are they each bringing to this conversation?
Yeah, good question. So we have the Hills case, and that was written about by John Fuller, I believe. And so that book, The Interrupted Journey, is essential for the hypnotist later. Similarly, Dolores Cannon has a very similar history as Hopkins and Jacobs, but came to different conclusions and have a sort of different standing in the community. She also looked to the interrupted journey. She also was not trained. She also worked with these UFO reporting organizations. And so we can start then in the 70s with the APRO, it's like Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. That was associated with the Lorenzens, who was a couple who wrote a book called Abducted, which is like the first book in like 3 that involved like abducted in the title. But they formed an example of researchers working with a UFO reporting organization to collect tales about abduction and publish them in a mass market book. So I believe that was 1977. Then Bud Hopkins comes along in 1981. He was researching his own UFO cases and things like that. He wrote the book Missing Time. That's so important. From there, he wrote a couple other books. Intruders is important because it tells the story of intrusions by space aliens, but formed the basis for a CBS miniseries in 1991. And that's essential as well to the argument we'll get to around unusual personal experiences. But this was heavily promoted. It was like 5-hour miniseries telling the story of Bud Hopkins and John Mack about discovering the abduction scenario, but it was told all in fiction. And it really collapsed a lot of the complexities down to a very simple thing. Space aliens are doing this to me and they control my mind, sort of thing. And there's not that complexity that we even see in all of the abduction writers have a sense of the complexity, which is I like seeing because that means they're self-reflective about the tools they're using. So we're still just in the early 80s with Bud Hopkins' Missing Time. The next thing, the major author that I'll point to is Thomas Bullard. He was a folklorist. He received some of the first grant money to do abduction research that I know of. So the Fund for UFO Research gave him $500 to do this folklore thing. Less than $1 per page or whatever he says. His work is so influential. It's so hard to find. It's so hard to read because it's on this sort of monospace typewritten thing, and he has charts and everything. He analyzed 270 of the published cases about abduction in the mid 80s. So that's 1987. That was the basis for a lot of scientific interest. And that in part helped all of the abduction researchers in the 90s go, what is actually happening? And they go, oh, there's different segments. He's the guy that categorized it, tagged all of this stuff, made the coding systems. And his work still stands the test of time, I say, and is so hard to find. I would love to reprint that with him in the future. That's one of my dreams. So that was really seminal. And then from there, we start getting conferences in around 1991 that starts to bring together like Jacobs, Hopkins, and Mack. And then this is in the context, like there was a conference in Philadelphia that brought together Robert Bigelow and the Prince of Liechtenstein came in. They all got together. They all had kind of inspiration going, this is a real thing. We need to study it scientifically. So from that point on, the abduction research has absolutely and drastically changed. So the moment of shifting from the 80s to the 90s. Love to dive more into the 90s, but I want to see if you have any questions or reflections about the 70s and 80s so far. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that so for those who don't know, Bud Hopkins was an artist, a painter, writer, but primarily known as an artist who started doing abduction research. And then he's the one who got John Mack involved in all of this. And you can find tons of interviews where John Mack would be like, I thought he was crazy. thought this guy was out of his mind. And then he sits down and he said, well, we started working together. And then I realized there's something going on here. And that's what pulled John Mack into it. And he was such a believer that there was something real to this, that he risked losing his tenure at Harvard. He was the head of psychiatry at Harvard. So there's a lot going on there. And I wonder, how do you look at the relationship between Bud Hopkins and John Mack? And how does that, how do you square that circle? They seem like for people who would say Bud Hopkins is a non-professional who doesn't know what he's doing, but here's John Mack working right alongside him for all these years. Clearly, there must have been something going on there. What are your thoughts on that relationship and what came out of it?
Yeah, so I'll respond with the kind of complexity that I warned you about, where I'll have a skeptical and credulous response that might be offensive to either side. So I'm just warning that. How I square Bud Hopkins and John Mack is I observed that both of them lacked understanding of dreams, sleep science, and hypnosis. And this is controversial to say about John Mack. And this is in part why I sent you the list of references I've looked through. So I can actually ground these claims in literature. I say John Mack actually was expert in Freudian psychoanalysis, not in scientific study of dreams, sleep, or hypnosis. So those are two different things, actually. And that produces a situation where John Mack is more confident in his ability to discern truth from fiction in hypnosis because he's not aware of the false memory research going on. He's not aware of the prevalence rates of sleep paralysis, dream reality confusion, and a lot of the other exotic dream phenomena that might help explain the abduction situation. So he doesn't know more than Bud Hopkins about hypnosis. And so that's a problematic situation. And that's actually a surprise to me when I looked into it. I assumed he had expertise in it. It took me years actually to go, what does he actually know about dreams? And I was shocked when I looked into it. And that is really telling actually, because his method he uses to distance himself from hypnosis. Because in the 90s, everyone goes, oh, hypnosis is problematic. So what ends up happening is Bud Hopkins gets sort of pushed to the side, like stigmatized, right, as a unprofessional. But John Mack is elevated, saying, hey, he's a psychiatrist. He knows what he's doing. And so in that time, he goes, I'm no longer using hypnosis that Bud Hopkins taught me. I'm using a light relaxation method informed by holotropic breathing. This is a method given by Stanislav Grof to explore psychedelic states, let's say. That is not proven to be a reliable means of memory retrieval. So in that way, he is just the same as Bud Hopkins. That's what I'm saying. But at the same time, he is a trained observer. He says something real happening. There's something that changes the trajectory of his life. And that's the thing that I really want to get to when I'm talking about false memory and hypnosis as not a good means of historic memory retrieval. There's something actually happening there that convinces these people something real is happening. And I say that is generally the consistency of themes, the body marks, the teleportation events. There's things like that are undeniable when you start listening to testimony. And so that's really problematic for skeptics who go, okay, John Mack, Bud Hopkins, they don't know anything about dreams, sleep, or hypnosis. We don't need to consider their perspective. But actually, we need to consider their perspective and their subjects' perspectives who are actually telling us something that was enough for John Mack to go, okay, let's give up the career and go straight into it. So it's a little bit complex, but I'm saying that there was a layer of misinformation or misunderstanding about hypnosis between Hopkins and Mack. They shared it. And they also explored some very real data, and their conclusions about the ET hypothesis may be questioned. But just like Mack went into Passport to Cosmos and went into this sort of shamanic kind of greater consciousness exploration, I think that's where the whole kind of abduction field needs to go. But I think it has to go through a recognition that the methods of hypnosis are flawed means of memory retrieval, but are meaning-making tools that are not problematic when we understand them as kind of a tool of consciousness and not as forensic memory retrieval. So that was a complicated answer. I'd love to hear any reflections or questions at this point.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think some people may be wondering how one gets to a position where you're the head of psychiatry at Harvard without understanding how to clearly differentiate between the dreams of one individual and the reality of somebody else. And I think John Mack has said he's on record a number of times saying that these are real experiences. These are real experiences that really happen to these real people. These are people. Something is coming into our world and doing something physical. And I've even got a clip of him on CBS New York saying that quote.
When I first heard about Bud Hopkins who was the pioneer researcher here, and that he took seriously these stories of people who reported being abducted, I thought there must be something wrong with him, and probably these people were suffering from some new form of mental illness. But in the past 4 years, I've worked now with approximately 90 people who've had these experiences, and they tell a very similar story. And initially, at least in the early years, they hadn't been in communication with each other. They were deeply distressed by their experiences. The experiences were reported in great detail. They were complex narratives of being taken by alien beings into UFOs on beams of light. They were embarrassed, ashamed to come forward about it.
And you don't think these were wild dreams,
not
hallucinations?
Not at all. These are very solid people, healthy, mentally healthy people. And the only thing I knew that behaves like that is real experience. This is not the way dreams behave. This is not the way mental illness behaves. It's not the way fantasy behaves. Some kind of real experience is occurring to these people. But if this is a real experience, that is some kind of entities, beings, intelligences are entering our world and affecting hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people according to polls, then this is something really worth looking at. So that's what I've been trying to do, is get people at least look at it, think about it.
This is something really physical happening in our world. And so I think, could you talk a little bit more about where you draw the line and how you differentiate between, when we talk about dreams, I think most people are pretty comfortable with the difference between the dreaming state and the waking state, and they could pretty clearly differentiate between the two in their own lives. Where does that line get fuzzy, in your view, for people who claim to have had contact or experiences or abductions?
Yeah, this is the heart of the question for me around this. And is the question: how did John Mack, head of Harvard Psychiatry, get to be head of Harvard Psychiatry and not know about dreams, right? And so there's a couple of explanations. One is there is a universal bias within Western culture against dreaming. So scholars are now recognizing it, and I call it the monophasic bias. And so that is monophasic or polyphasic, means to one or many phases of consciousness. So monophasic means you're attributing reality to only the waking phase. Polyphasic means you're attributing reality to many phases of consciousness. And so shamanic and indigenous cultures, and pretty much every culture except for Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic cultures, they all believe dreams have some degree of reality, that we interact with real beings in there, that they can have real impacts on our lives. And sometimes they develop rich systems of prophecy around it, or, you know, there's tales in Mack's books about indigenous people using UFOs as sort of a teleportation kind of taxi service or whatever. So there's a lot there. And though it's a complex thing, because dreams respond to our intentions, and like what we believe about them impacts what we know about them and actually our experience of them. So the fact is, Western culture, mainstream culture, hasn't really known about dreams that much. We discovered REM dreaming in like the 50s. We got a lot of information around it. Lucid dreaming was confirmed in 1980. So it's like slow coming online. So scientific study of dream content really wasn't developed until the 70s or so. So this is like really developing quantitative analysis of dreams, not just Freudian stuff. So there was so much confusion, and there's still so much confusion around it. And even now I go to school and I talk to clinical psychiatrists, and they have no idea who cares about dreams, right? How do you work with them? Who cares, right? Like that's not anxiety. That's not depression. That you can't fix that with a pill. And so they just push it aside. So that's our culture in general. So John Mack wasn't out of the ordinary in that understanding. It's only someone who's gone out of their way to really develop an understanding of dream and sleep science that you could expect that in culture. So that gives a situation where we think of dreams as only nocturnal fantasies, only nocturnal hallucinations. But when we look to shamanic dreaming cultures, everyone else except for us, there's a lot of wild stuff that happens. There's interaction with beings. There's teleportation stories. There's all these stories that would contextualize the UFO encounter. And so when we hear dream stuff or whatever, we go, oh, that's just nocturnal fantasy. And so that's why I'm bringing that up, because the bias created the situation where John Mack didn't have any education about dream studies, but it also created a scenario where we as a culture are not aware that dreams can really change our lives in dramatic and kind of invasive ways, let's say. So, if we knew more about indigenous dreaming practices or read more about that, we might have identified more precedents for abduction, is what I'm saying.
So correct me if I'm wrong here. As I try to understand this, it sounds like what you're saying is that we were building the tools at the same time as we were trying to learn about something we have no idea what we're looking at. And so the tools that we were building in Western mental health and science were just inadequate or in not suitable for really the task at hand. We didn't have the full language. We didn't have full toolkit to dissect these experiences and really look at them for what they actually are. Is that accurate?
100%. Yeah. Like in the early 90s, in 1994, when John Mack went on Oprah and talked about his book and brought forward that testimony, that was the same year Elizabeth Loftus wrote her book called The Myth of Repressed Memory, which was a huge influential work about false memory in legal testimony and the use of hypnosis. So these things are published parallel. They're not, it's like John Mack, it's reasonable to think perhaps he never actually looked into it at that time. Now, 2 years later, right, there's more skepticism about abduction coming forward, and there's more information coming in. And he's responding by talking about holotropic breathing instead of hypnosis and things like that. So it's an ongoing dialogue. And I think if he hadn't died, like, oh my God, we would be so much further in this dialogue because when his death happened, sort of as a culture, we have to fall back on Jacobs and Hopkins and the ET hypothesis, and no one's moving forward this kind of consciousness-based thing, where I think he would have integrated the science around dreams and hypnosis had he had enough time. He just didn't. And so we're sort of stuck in that. I think we're suffering from that in contemporary dialogue.
Yeah, he was such a powerful figure in the field because he lent so much credibility to this research. He was like the Gary Nolan of that time, like somebody of his stature and background to be able to say publicly that they're looking at this and taking it seriously gave cover to a lot of other people to come forward and say, I had an experience, or this is what happened to me, or it happened to my mom, or whoever. So I think it was a tragic loss. And I've heard it said that it was a complete and total accident, that he just walked across the street in the UK and got hit by a car. But he was a New Yorker. I feel like this guy's crossed enough streets. He's jaywalked a billion times. And probably, I don't know. That's something about that rubs me the wrong way. But tragically, we lost his expertise. And then we were left sort of with it seems like for a number of years, just sort of no one really looking at this. I mean, like you said, David Jacobs a little bit, who's mostly, I think, retired and stepped away from it now. And do you have any thoughts on Carla Turner? She had some really interesting takes on this that were kind of different than Bud Hopkins and Jacobs and others.
Yeah, I'm just getting into Carla Turner right now. So she talked a lot about it being sort of consciousness-based experience, or like I looked at her, I said, okay, she's writing within the context of the ET hypothesis under the kind of epistemology or the way of knowing as Hopkins or Jacobs or Mack. So she doesn't stand out.
In her case, she personally is an experience. She says she was abducted a number of times and then had a number of different encounters with military people, and her phones were tapped. She's one of those folks who is like, it's really hard to figure out where to put her because she's got so much personal material that she's drawing on. How does that factor in for you?
Oh, I mean, that excites me, to be honest, because I always look for, I'm looking for people who are writing about this, who can reference it to some level of rigor and also have an introspective quality to me. So, like I said, I haven't read her work deeply. I go, where does she fit in the argument? Does she stand out in terms of that? You're saying yes, the personal experience. I say yes also because of her themes of an interpretation. It feels like it's more open to consciousness. The sense of being an experiencer looking into this is very exciting to me. And I will do more reading about this, about Carla Turner as well. Kathleen Martin is like that. She is an experiencer, and when I look through, I look through all of even Carla Turner's reference list about dreams and things like that, and hypnosis. And Kathleen Martin, who's the niece of Betty and Barney Hill, writes really wonderfully. She goes, it's not like hypnopompic hallucination. It's not like this. And she cites references so I can go, I know exactly what she's talking about. Mm-hmm. So I want to do something it seems like Carla Turner is a great person to do that with. Do you have any insights that you feel I should hear right now about her work?
She did a great presentation. I think it was a MUFON presentation she did in 1994. I have a clip pulled up. She did a number of presentations, but this one in particular was on the myths surrounding abductions, or the abduction research that was going on at the time. And she even begins her presentation by saying,
fact number one, we do not know with any certainty exactly what these entities may be. Extraterrestrial, interdimensional, terrestrial in origin, some combination of all of the above, something we have yet to even dream of. I'm going to use the term alien merely for convenience, and I am not implying that I believe they are from another planet. Now, certainly they may well be. We just don't know, and that's a fact. The aliens themselves have identified a number of different origins to various abductees and contactees throughout the years. But of course, we humans have absolutely no way to check out any of the statements that they've made. Therefore, we cannot know these things, as the dictionary says about facts, to be certain, to be objectively verifiable.
I'm going to use the term extraterrestrial, but I do not mean to say that I know that they are aliens. I'm just saying these are not people, not humans the way we understand them. But as to what they actually are, she opens her presentation saying she doesn't really know. And then she goes on to say, what else did she say in that presentation? She acknowledges the fact that many, many, many of the predictions that abductees are given about future events never take place. And she finds that very suspicious. She says either they are intentionally giving us wrong information or there's something else going on here, because none of these things are actually happening. So there's some kind of element there. And then she highlights the military sort of aspect of all this, where abductees will report an anomalous experience, an abduction encounter, or something along those lines, and then within days or weeks, or sometimes months afterward, being having their phones tapped, having helicopters circle around their house, aircraft flying overhead that are military aircraft. They seem to be under some kind of observation, and very close observation. And of course, this is all back in the late 80s, early 90s, when there weren't drones, or not everybody had a smartphone, so they would actually follow these people around. And in that presentation, I think she makes a really interesting case for something is happening. There are physical traces that lead us to believe this is physical, real phenomenon. The military is involved somehow, but we really don't know. And we don't know what we don't know. And I think that's probably the most interesting thing about Carla Turner. She comes right out and says, we don't know what we don't know. And even what we do know, we can't trust it because there's so much weirdness there. David Jacobs, on the other hand, has a great presentation that he opens with, to your point, all of the problems with hypnosis. And he comes right out and he says, look, I'm not a professional hypnotist. I'm not professionally trained to do this. These are all the problems with memory. And then you have to add all the problems with hypnosis, and you add all of these other problems. And then he comes out of that with this really interesting point. And he goes, despite all of those problems, I still, through hundreds and hundreds of interviews that I've done with people, they still have the same common reports. They say that so many of the same details keep coming up. He said, I can't ignore that. That seems very, very unlikely to happen any other way. And some of the things that they talk about being really specific things, like he talks a lot. I think this is the one that we mentioned in the Kelly Chase interview about abductees being on a craft. They're shown a screen, some screen. They're in a room and there's like a TV screen or a movie screen, and they look at it and they hear the telepathic voice in their mind saying, can you tell the difference between you and us? And on the screen, it's a picnic and it's just a bunch of people in a park. And the person goes, no, I can't tell. What's the difference? They all look the same to me. And then the voice goes, oh, well, see, isn't that great? Soon we're all going to be together and everything's going to be fine. And it's really chilling and very strange, and it's really bizarre. And it's just like one of those weird things. So I don't, that's the thing. I think abduction, this phenomenon is fascinating. This aspect of it is so interesting. And there's clearly something happening that's changing the trajectory of people's lives.
Yep.
But as to who's got which piece of the puzzle, I don't even think any one of us really can tell. And that's why it's so interesting that you've got a new hypothesis on this. And I'm wondering, can you talk to us a little bit about D-SETI and explain how that differentiates from everything else that we've talked about so far? How do we get to that?
Sure. Yeah. So D-SETI stands for the Dream Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, or the Dream Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. So that arises from my own contact experience and yearnings and things like that, or explorations. As a kid, I had a lot of dreams that I thought may be the basis for abduction. And so that was one of the reasons why I was exploring these and UFOs and stuff like that. That understanding is classic UFO abduction syndrome. So in the early 90s, we defined, or the abduction researchers defined, the UFO abduction syndrome. This was influential in the history, but that sense, and I need to talk about that because that impacted my life, because when I looked at culture going, how can I make sense of my dream encounters? The world says, well, dreams are not really real. They're Freudian, whatever, wish fulfillment. And then there were these other people that go, these dreams are very real, so real, they'll steal your body and like do these things to you. And I go, okay, that feels right to me. That level of interpretation feels right to me. And so I was afraid of my dreams for a long time because I was afraid of abduction. I was afraid of uncovering that because of abduction. But I was compelled to explore because of the rabbit hole quality, whatever drives people into those rabbit holes, this like drove me into it. And I said, I just have to figure this out. And I would reach out with my dreams because I knew about lucid dreams. I knew about dream intent, and I knew a little bit about dream shamanism, right? I knew that you could have dream telepathy, right? There's scientific meta-analysis that show humans can send each other imagery through dreams, and that's beautiful. What if you could do that with aliens, right? Like that was basically the idea. And so I explored that for, in 2010, I got that idea for a massive database. I go, if we collected people's dreams, we'd be able to see evidence of these aliens talking to us, or ETs talking to us through our dreams. And then I have to experience that. I have to explore that myself. In 2012, I started exploring that. I had all these lights in the sky. I had all highly strange stuff happening. I had dreams that were so powerful, it just shut me down for 5 years or whatever. Like, I'm done. They responded. How bizarre is that? Like the aliens or ETs, they responded. I had dreams I never had before, gave insight information. And so then in 2020, I'm starting to think, okay, something is really here. I'm being driven forward in this way by way of like a mission. It's related to this UFO stuff, related to contact. I go, what would it look like if I started working with people and started bringing forward this testimony and doing the research behind it to really I got into a PhD program a year or two later, and that's in order to define public knowledge about this. I go, what if somebody who sort of believed abductees got in the system and just wrote a dissertation on it? Like, that's way different than having Jacobs, an amateur hypnotist, like write a book about it. I'm going to write a dissertation. So that's where I'm at, and it's really around using dreams as a means of knowledge for these interactions. And the reason why that I think is effective with abduction is because in the early 90s, they definitively defined abduction in terms of dreams and hypnosis. So you can't get away from dreams if you're talking about hypnosis. And so it's sort of thinking, well, if the abduction experience, it can either be primarily physical with psychic side effects or primarily psychic with physical side effects. And so I think Hopkins and Jacobs said, hey, it's primarily physical. Mack sort of went, it actually might be primarily psychic with physical side effects. And so if that's the case, then our understanding of dreams could be directly applicable to the encounter phenomena. And that's really where I'm at, is sort of opening this space of D-SETI to go, what if it is like a dream? But what if it's, there's a lot about dreams we don't understand or haven't. So what if it is like a telepathic dream or shamanic dream or any other types of anomalous dream? And I think asking that question will enable both skeptical and credulous people to work together to develop science on this. And if it so happens hypnosis works, that's great. If it so happens it's just dreamlike, but producing physical effects, that would be fascinating to find out too. So that's where I'm at now, yeah.
Do you leave open the possibility that this could just be actual physical aliens coming here and physically putting people on board ships and taking them somewhere and doing physical? There seems to be this reflexive reaction to say, what is the other way we can explain this other than it's really happening? There's always seems to be like a pushback, like, well, maybe it's some other kind of trauma that's childhood abuse that's manifesting in some way through this weird mental imagery that was affected by science fiction and movies that we've seen and all these things, and now it's coming out 30 years later. But could it just be as simple as it's actually happening and it's real, and at least in some percentage of the people who claim that it's happened to them?
I always leave open the possibility that someone had a physical interaction of abduction. I believe that the intelligence agencies are able to do that and simulate alien abductions and things like that. And so I leave open that possibility, right? I'm never going to go, hey, your experience is only just a dream because of that possibility. I also started my work under that hypothesis, the ET hypothesis. There's craft in this space, in this world that have psychic beings in them that are doing these things. And so one of my first encounters, or my first client, was a man named Dan Berg, who had this incredible missing time experience. And it happened at a human initiated contact event involving a number of kind of famous contactees, Ricardo Gonzalez, Paula Harris, Rob Freeman. They were all there doing CE5, and he was taken away. During that time, he was filmed leaving the group. He was filmed coming back. There's obvious signs of psychic distress. And at the time, there was a light in the sky pulsating that wasn't moving relative to the stars. So it's like a UFO. I thought that was a UFO craft that beamed him up. And this is in footage. Like Rob Freeman's a content creator and produced some content about this. I watched it and I was like, this is absolutely the most documented missing time event ever. It is, and in my heart, I was like, this is definitely a UFO and space aliens. And so he asked me to do a hypnosis with him to figure out what happened in his missing time. So I thought, oh my God, like there's never been a hypnotist that has started with such clear documentation of missing time in history. Like never. We don't have concurrent footage with a UFO. We don't have there's so much there. And so I got to thinking about how am I going to approach this? And I thought, well, if they actually exhibit have the skills that they say they have, like these people say they're psychic and things like that, and time traveling. So psychic time travelers in spacecraft, then they actually look different than physical humans. Even if they're physical humans or ETs in craft, if they can time travel, teleport, and are psychic, they actually are of such a different class that even the physical categories of perception and what it means to be historic. What does a historic event mean, right? If they can create screen memories, and if they can go back in time, and if they can move me forward and stuff like that, I then got to the point where I said, a regression is not a regression. We are absolutely not dealing with memory, even if we are just dealing with memory here, because they can travel back in time and do psychic stuff. So my understanding with that hypnosis regression was we're not doing memory retrieval. We're creating a channel of communications between us and those psychic beings on that spacecraft. And so I did deeply entertain that possibility for years. And it was only until I read the literature related to unusual personal experiences that I sent you that I really started opening up to the possibility it wasn't physical in the way that the ET hypothesis describes.
Do you have any, I don't want to put you on the spot because I know there's so many cases and it's hard to study them all, but you seem to be very well read, and I wonder if you've read The Keepers by Jim Sparks. Are you familiar with Jim Sparks?
No, tell me about it.
Jim Sparks is a abductee who he's got a great presentation that he did at MUFON in 2013. He actually died recently. He died a few years ago, but he is one of the very few abductees who claims conscious recall of all his experiences. And he talks about the way that he figured out that he was being taken was that
the window was a ground. It was a floor. It was down at the floor level, the window, and we would walk through the window and into the woods, and then experiences would take place on board. And they would bring me back the same way, again, walking through the window. So here, in this example, they distorted matter and made the window and the matter itself, creating some sort of a field where you can pass right through it. So that's a pretty strong ability when you can just make a wall not there, in a sense, and walk through that wall. And I think what made, that whole particular scene, or that scenario particularly amazing, was the fact that whatever was out in the front yard and on the grass would stick to the bottom of my feet because there would be dew on the grass, and my footprints, the heel of my toe would be entrenched in the lawn, and then my toes would be on the carpet and embedded in the carpet, so you can see it, the ball of my feet and my toes. So half a foot is outside and the other half is inside. So, and then all the grass and everything that would be stuck in the bottom of my feet, I would drag through into the bedroom. So those were the first signs that matter could be manipulated.
He talked about at one point he was sleeping with a revolver under his pillow. He had gotten so paranoid, he would get in his car and he would drive to the middle of the city and he would get a room in a hotel right in the middle of a big high-rise hotel, so that he thought if he could just be stacked between people, they couldn't get to him. And for years and years, he went through a number of experiences where it just tested his sanity and he was just stretched to the limit. And he wrote about his experiences in a book called The Keepers. And then he talks about it in this MUFON presentation, which I'll link to in the show notes. But there's that case. There's the case of Terry Lovelace, the incident at Devil's Den, where he was taken on board. He claims to have been taken on board a craft with a friend of his when they were on a camping trip together. And then they both had radiological problems afterwards. They'd been exposed to radiation. They had physical effects, health effects. They were, he was just serving in, I believe, the Air Force at the time. And he was brought back to base and debriefed aggressively by the intelligence people there. He saw a craft over his campsite. It scanned the ground with laser beams. And then he has missing time. He wakes up, his clothes are on backwards. His shoes are on the wrong feet. And he pulls himself together, and then he and his friend get in their car and leave. And his friend is just like catatonic for days. And again, in his presentation, he explains all of this in greater detail. But there seems to be a number of abductee cases that are very buttressed on all sides by physical evidence that is, it's really hard to imagine a dream experience changing the color of paint on the hood of your car, or exposing your car to radiation and making your electronics short out and things like that. How do you account for reports like that from people who claim to have had these experiences themselves? Not just, if we get away from the researchers just looking at it from the outside, I'm talking about the people who are actually claiming the experiences personally. How does that fit in?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And that's what I think about a lot with this. So the first response I'll say is, from the perspective of like scholarly critical literature review, is I don't need to write. It's like logically saying that the hypnotists are, have the problems of hypnosis and stuff like that, talking about that and talking about the experiences being dreamlike in nature, right? We can say, hey, the experiences that you said, Sparks and Lovelace, they may be dreamlike in nature because they involve fantastic beings and emotions and things like that, and expansions of consciousness, things like that. So that's the one thing I'll observe is like logically the arguments sort of still stand. Now, there's a couple of responses that really excite me about this line of questioning. The first is that the physical evidence may actually be physical evidence of extended human capacity or psionic interactions with extraterrestrial or non-human intelligences, right? It doesn't have to be evidence for alien spacecraft. The one bit I would talk about is Kathy Davis, who's the subject of Intruder, in response to some controversies that came up in 2011 in the community, was like, hey, Bud Hopkins is the one that said they were aliens and spaceships. I just said they were like lights and beings, right? Like, and so we can throw away the notion of aliens, but we still have to account for what you're saying is like the lights and the beings. And I say, there's something very real happening here. And the hypothesis I would put forward isn't new necessarily around this. It's was talked a little bit about in the early 80s by Paul Devereaux. It's called the Earth light hypothesis. It's basically that there's plasma, like balls of light. There's plasma beings that have a sort of proto-consciousness that have an electromagnetic effect, and they blast our mind or something like that. I say that in my view, the whole experience, especially that involving missing time, screen memories, fantastic beings, weird interactions, high strangeness, all of that is dreamlike, can be understood like a dream. Now, it's not a nocturnal dream because dreams in altered states of consciousness can happen throughout waking phase. It's like really like there's so much more than what is just nocturnal. So I say it's all sort of can be accounted for like that. It's similar, but it's revealing, hey, we might be able to induce dreams where we can teleport, where we can substantiate footprints, where we can do marks on the body and that sort of stuff, where there's teleportation happening. I was recently challenged with a case, the Amy Rylance case from Australia, where she teleported. She was seen going into a beam of light. 2 hours later, she's 800 kilometers away, like taken by a hospital being like, why are you so dehydrated? You're like 6 days dehydrated or whatever. She has a mark on the body. There's so much physical, there's radiation there. So I actually hypothesize there is an engagement with something like a ball of light or a light figure that does have the capacities of radiation, of producing some evidence. And I say that blob of light is like a masterful dream shaman, meaning they have the capacity to create and control shared dream states, which accounts for the screen memory and the high strangeness of those events. But they have real physical effects that are like teleportation and stuff like that. And for that case of teleportation, the Amy Rylance case, there are precedents of Aborigines traveling 600 kilometers in 2 hours. She did 800 kilometers in 3 hours. It's like kind of the same. So the hypothesis there is they went into a shared dream state, like a consciousness state that's only well understood within indigenous or alternative ideas. We in the West are like, dreams are stupid. They're from like wish fulfillment, so that you can't teleport through them. But what if you could is sort of the idea here. And the reason why it's worth talking about is because on the one hand, we have the notion that aliens and spacecraft are doing things to us. On the other hand, there's something where it's like a dreamlike scenario where we can kind of know a bit about dreams, in that maybe we can actually learn more about these capacities, like teleportation, or how we get marks on the body, or how the footprints happen. That would reveal stuff to us about the world.
I'm not entirely against the idea of the dream state being like a real place, a plane where activity takes place. I actually find that line of reasoning very fascinating, because weirdly, I think Carlos Castaneda's books say more about the UFO phenomenon. When I'm reading the Don Juan books, you're kind of like, this sounds like there's a lot of overlap between the UFO phenomenon and what he's talking about. And those books, for people who don't know, are about an anthropologist who stays with a Mexican sorcerer for a period of time, and it's about sorcery and magic and the astral plane and all kinds of different things. But there's so much overlap between UFO lore and what they're talking about. And I also find that in reports of near-death experiences, NDEs, there seems to be a lot of overlap. So I definitely think there's some kind of a there. And I was wondering if, are we maybe making the mistake of trying to shoehorn what we think is happening into a very limited type of language that we have for describing reality? And is it just a case of reality is just bigger and weirder than we think it is, and we've just got this mistaken idea about what we're actually dealing with? In a sense, it sounds like what you're describing is just as complex and bizarre as the idea of a physical craft just taking somebody on board and doing experiments on them. But weirdly, I guess for me, it's almost in a way easier to believe that is really happening. Like they would just come here, take somebody, study them, pull their blood, do DNA analysis, figure out, just the way that we would do with any other animal. But you draw a very clear distinction between these two worlds. And so can you take us through your understanding of the dream world and kind of educate us a little bit on what is happening in the dream state? How is it different than what we understand it to be in Western culture as we are taught?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah. So the biggest thing around what we're taught in Western culture is dreams are just dreams. Like they don't matter. They don't have an impact on waking life. And that they're probably produced by the brain processing stuff, or something you've eaten, or your desires or whatever. So,
but they're meaningless, and there's not really much, there's no there. It's just dream stuff,
yes.
Right?
Yeah. And that's true at a level. That's like most of our dreams are sort of like that, but you can keep going down in this nested doll experience. Dreams are typically understood within all other cultures to be real, to engage real interactions. And these real interactions are kind of understood to be in like a realm of spirit. So it's not this world. It's like the upper world or lower world. If you're familiar with shamanic stuff, it's the etheric, it's the astral planes. It's something like that. So basically the idea is that at night, the soul sometimes goes on journeys and comes back, and they go through the spirit world and they have interactions. So some people might go to radically different places in those worlds, depending on the culture, the expectations, the person. We all have our own unique capacities with dreams and how we perceive dreams. Some people see them in color. Some people don't. Some people hear words. Some people just get it telepathically. So there's wide range of skills and experiences there. Then dreams blur the line between paranormal and normal. So people talk about precognitive dreams, and even people who don't believe in psi stuff will be like, hey, I had this dream. You were in it. And wouldn't it be funny if that thing happened? And they'll take action based on their dreams. And they oftentimes will attribute reality to that precognition. So there's telepathy that happens. There's out of body experiences that happen. There's one thing that I've loved doing recently with scientific literature is finding sort of the prevalence rates of strange dream phenomena, like out of body experiences, happen to 10% of people 1 to 2 times in their life, and that's it. So sleep paralysis is somewhere around there, right? Like dream reality confusion is 11 to 25% of people. So people who have been confused as to whether or not a dream event happened or a waking event, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of weird phenomena that happen in dreams that we just haven't collected together and categorized yet as a culture. So a lot can really happen. People who deeply look into dreams generally, there's 2 camps. One is this very Western kind of dreams don't mean anything camp. And then there's another camp that says, actually, the dreamers are telling me a lot of stuff. There's precognition, there's angel visitations, miraculous healings, all sorts of stuff associated with dreams. And so that for me tells me there's way more happening in the dream world. And then in fact, the next thing I would say around dreams is that it isn't just limited to nocturnal hallucinations. Dream scientists really cannot define what is the difference between dreaming and waking. They go, different parts of the brain are active, but it looks like we're doing the same thing, which is constructing a reality, a modeled reality about the inputs of our senses. And it's happening at night, it's happening in the day. Because this part turns off, one part in the brain, things get really bizarre. And another part turns off, and you're sort of aware but can't move your body. And another part turns on in REM or non-REM, and there's these different qualities that come through. But it's all the same activity of constructing this reality. And so I think that's what happening is even in waking phase. And so when we have these interactions, we may be interacting with different sources of actual sensation, right, through the pineal gland or whatever. We don't know how that comes in. But it's actual sensation, just like the physical senses, and we're constructing it. In the dream experience, we get a lot of personal imagination and a lot of belief system. So that's the essential part of dream shamanism is dream interpretation. So this is why I get really excited about when authors express a sense of discernment. We don't know what's happening. Is this an alien? Is this something else? That sort of thing really excites me because there's a sense that we need to engage that sense of discernment. It can never just be one thing. And that even if we had the clearest, most direct interaction in dreams with an ET or whatever, we'd still have to interpret it through the lens of personal imagination, because that's essential to dreaming.
I think I understand what you're saying. It sounds like if it were a Venn diagram, our experience of reality is all sort of happening internally anyway. We can only experience it from our own internal perspective. So your dreams are as much a part of that as your waking state, right? You're saying that it's all part of the same experience of reality. We draw an artificial line between waking reality and sleeping reality, and we just say half of this doesn't really count for anything unless you do some weird interpretation of it. Is that fair? Am I?
Yeah, that's where we're at. Half of it doesn't matter. It's all the same thing, but it's depending on whether or not this reality is plugged into the source of external physical sensation or internal psychic sensation, basically.
Are you coming from the perspective of consciousness is generated by the brain, or that the consciousness is somehow ubiquitous and universal and the brain is sort of more like a transceiver? Or do you have where are you at on that? Like what is consciousness in your view?
Yes. Personally, and philosophically, consciousness is primary. And then we're something like a transceiver. So I believe that our physical bodies are substantiated using similar methods as our dream bodies are substantiated at. That implies that there is some hyper real version of you and me that has a different level of body. And we're not sure what that is because it's a different higher order space time, something like that.
And there was a book written a few years back by a neurologist. I want to say it was a neurologist, but he might have been a brain surgeon. He had a encephalitis. I forget what he had. He had some kind of swelling of the brain, and he was a subject matter expert in consciousness. He was basically dead for a period of time, and all his friends were, top tier, high speed doctors as well, and they vouched that he had no brain activity for a period of days. And he says in his book, and I wish I could recall the name of it right now, but it's an NDE book, and he talks about how he had the most real experience that he can remember during that period where he was in another world. He had of exchanges with other beings that were just as real as anybody here, and they gave him information, and he brought some of that information back, and then he went on to write the book, and he talked about it'll come back to me. But there are many cases of reports like that where people say that they've had a near-death experience and their consciousness just continued on. They died on the operating table and they were just, now they're in the room, they're looking down, and they just go on to keep having experiences, almost as if their consciousness is the constant, and it's the physical body is just sort of like a meat spacesuit that it wears while it's awake in this physical world. I wonder, to what extent do you see overlap between near-death experiences and contact experiences as reported by UFO contactees?
I got about 80% of that because of the internet troubles. You were asking around the connection between near-death and contact experiences. Is that correct?
More or less, yeah. What are your thoughts about that? There seems to be a lot of overlap there. Do you think that's all part of the same conversation, or are those two different conversations that we should be having separately?
Oh, I think in terms of contact experiences, absolutely. The recent work by the CCRI, Contact and Consciousness Research Institute, which comes out of the Dr. Edgar Mitchell's Foundations for Research into Extraordinary and Extraterrestrial Experiences. This is a source of new scholarly research going on. If you're not familiar with it, check it out. They have a book called Beyond UFOs. They put forward that proposal because the consciousness primary idea that near death, poltergeist, remote viewing, and contact is all together. They put forward it's the contact modality notion. So that's a great resource to get tuned into. And then I would say, I looked into the connection between abduction reports and lucid dreaming and near death. And even in the 80s, right, mid 80s, 1987, a dream researcher writes on the connection between near death, lucid dream, and abduction. It says, hey, this is fascinating, right? But it hasn't had citations, right? People aren't referencing it. And I often wonder why. And I think perhaps because of that experience we were talking about the bias against dreams. And it also requires a sense of self-discernment. Right. So we were talking about how the researchers like Carla Turner's an experiencer, right? And that makes it more interesting to have that sense of what's going on here. And then this sense of discernment, right? Can someone question, is this a space alien or is this something else? What's going on? And having that. So I think that requires a specific set of skills and experiences to even go, this abduction experience feels like a dream, and that feels like a near-death experience, right? I personally have those experiences because I've had a series of assisted out-of-body experiences. I had synchronicities guide me to training in lucid dreaming and spiritual medium stuff and shamanism and psychedelics. And I go, oh, okay, these are all similar. I would never have known that unless my life forced me on this path of discovery. And so I think we need to get there as a culture. And I'm really glad that psychedelics are coming more into the mix, mindfulness, meditation. I think it would be great to have dreams be more of a conversation. But once we start having a couple experiences, each of us, right? I mean, we can all have that. Even if people don't have the exotic phenomena, they can go in mindfulness, they can pay attention to their dreams, and they go, oh, there are these different stations of consciousness. And as I develop my skills with consciousness, I have more capacity to discern. And I think if we do that all as a culture, we'll start to go, oh, wow, the near death, out of body, and astral projection, and dream, and all of this is all sort of the same thing, but it has very different and real implications.
Almost like we're tripping all over ourselves trying to fit it into separate categories when you can't really be done that way. It's almost, I find it really interesting because you mentioned indigenous cultures a lot. And there was I recently read a book are you familiar with Artie Six Killer Clark? Oh,
tell me I know the name, but yeah, keep going.
She's a Native American professor and author, and she wrote a book where she basically went around and collected stories of contact from people of indigenous background. And she talked to a number of indigenous people who served in Vietnam. And they had, in this particular book, she tells a story about a number of people who were in the same unit together, and they had contact with blue beings, and how common that is. These big blue beings that seem to appear on the battlefield, and then they would heal certain people and they would help others. They couldn't understand combat. They thought that was crazy and weird, and they just observed us. And what is interesting, and what I'm getting at with that, is that it seems like indigenous folks, when they talk about contact, non-human intelligence, it's with sort of like a yawn and an eye roll, especially if they're talking to a white person. They're just sort of like, yeah, like we're the ones who are late to this thing. They've been dealing with it for thousands of years. They have a whole language and a culture that includes all of this. And for us, we have spent so much time trying to confuse the issue and forget about it and break up reality and look at it as in piecemeal sort of fashion. And I wonder, is that maybe what we're missing, is that the answers we're looking for regarding this are to be found by going back to indigenous cultures and taking the understanding and the wisdom that they've developed and applying it to what we're seeing? Or do you think that there's a way to do that, or has that been done? Has anyone looked at that?
Oh, I think so. And I think people do that every generation. There's a passage in John Keel in Mahatma Prophecies I recently read where he says, people have figured out contact every single generation since like the ancient Greeks. It's just that there is this capacity to transmit the spiritual education associated with that. And that level of discernment that we're talking about hasn't been so prevalent in our society. And so when we have in the indigenous cultures that are based in those sort of dream shamanic practices that get the non-human intelligence, they have that sort of continuity of spiritual education, or it's been disrupted, which is like unfortunate. The two things I will say about that is, one is, when in the papers about dream shamanism, they say it's not that specialized. Like it sounds like we might have to go back and learn a whole bunch and study with so many shaman or whatever, but actually we're all that naturally. So it's not that it's not like an advanced skill necessarily. It's a little bit of a mindset. And we'll be guided in that experience. There is a sort of strong reverence of beings and the interactions that can be had, and generally for the purpose of mediating the human fortune and negotiating the human non-human world. That's how it's sort of used in those cultures, it seems. And so we can really start doing that in our own lives by relating to non-human presences through dreams or other things. I also say the one thing I always want to bring up when we talk about indigenous shamanism is that Western culture also has an indigenous shamanic practice. And that it's not necessarily we're not either colonists or indigenous people sort of thing. It's sort of an intermix. So when I talk about shamanic practices and Western shamanic practices, they're still alive today. It's just sort of, there's a tension in mainstream culture around that. Some of the practices I look to are like ancient Greek, like the ancient Greek god of Asclepius had a lot of religious practices around inducing dreams. He was a shape-shifting reptilian humanoid who lived in the sky and had protocols you could interact with, right? So that looks to me like contact. I also look to the work of Dr. John Dee from the 16th century as an example of something like hypnotism that talked to what looks like aliens who produced what looks like metamaterial or mathematical communication. And so we have examples within Western culture to actually dive into Western indigenous spirituality or shamanism, as well as we should relate to the intact traditions and cultures and honor those and shift our way of being so we're not so disruptive. That would be really wonderful. But I think it can happen much more quickly than we might fear.
It seems like the role of the shaman, and as a white man, it's hard for me to really understand it, but I've had my own experiences which were kind of unique to my life that made a believer out of me. But it seems that the role of the shaman is to operate in both worlds and to bring back useful information that can be applied in this world from that world. And that's sort of the go-between from a cultural standpoint between that world, whatever that world may be, and this world. But you mentioned something else earlier that I thought was interesting, because you talked about sort of in the beginning of this interview about sometimes we have military involvement around this, or intelligence agencies that are involved around this. And it brought to mind I just saw this last week on Forbes YouTube channel. There was a congressional hearing about Havana syndrome. Have you followed any of this at all?
Only vaguely.
Okay, so I don't expect that you would know this, because it's just a weird clip that came across my radar. And when I looked at it, I was like, oh, maybe there's something here. And I'll insert that clip into this show so that people can see it. But they're talking about Havana syndrome, and recently, so Havana syndrome sort of being defined as this strange set of symptoms manifesting in people in our intelligence agencies who are deployed in certain parts of the world. And they seem to be the result of some kind of electromagnetic attack that's being perpetrated on these individuals. And the person who was doing the testimony in Congress was saying how the people, what's most alarming is the people who are being targeted, or the people who who have Havana syndrome. And this is something that Gary Nolan has looked at. He was actually one of the people brought in to look at some of the Havana syndrome effects on some of these folks. But this person who's testifying was saying that these are the people when they report something, what they have to say winds up on the president's desk. Like, that's the circle of people we're talking about who is being subjected to this. So throughout this little back and forth, it kind of comes out that the Soviets in the 80s thought we were doing this to them. They actually had cases that looked like Havana syndrome. So they started researching psychotronic weapons. And then now we're seeing it. And the question is it is it the Russians doing it to us? And was it us doing it to them in the beginning?
There's more than one way to achieve this same effect on the human brain. And one of the most disturbing denials that I've seen in some of the publications leading up to our findings being published was an attempt to create the impression that no technology would allow this impact on the human brain. That is provably untrue. There have been experiments that prove that both acoustic waves, directed waves in the ultrasound, primarily the ultrasound band, but also electromagnetic directed energy, especially pulsed nanosecond energy beams in the millimeter band, through something called the Frey effect, which converts electromagnetic energy into an acoustic band wave that can be within or without or outside of the audible band, can have the same effect on the human brain, which can have long-term concussion-like symptoms, but in really traumatic degree of concussion. A former member of Russia's intelligence community reached out to me and said, well, this is what we've been working on since the 80s, because we thought that the Americans were doing that to us, and we wanted to develop a counter technology for the same thing. So of course we're doing that. We know that members of this unit have engaged with scientists who have worked on a project called reversal of epilepsy symptoms through radio waves, which, for anybody known how Russia intelligence formulates their findings for the public-facing domain, should read them as the exact opposite, creating, reversing essentially the polarity, might leave with the exact opposite effect, creating epilepsy symptoms, and so on and so forth. This interest is long-running for the GRU, for Russia's military intelligence. One last thing I will mention is that we found that the only other place, other than among the cohort of American and Canadian intelligence and law enforcement officers who have been affected by this, that we've seen very, very similar symptoms, was in a Russian school in 2017. And we found the evidence to this similarity in a hacked email box of a military researcher from the St. Petersburg Institute for Experimental Medicine working for the GRU. This institute showed uncanny interest in exactly what happened in that school, where 26 children complained of exactly the symptoms that we've received in this investigation from American officers and diplomats. And again, it was this institute that followed up and did research and may have been behind those incidents in Russia. But we don't see them anywhere else other than around Russian operatives.
Mr. Syed, is it your belief that these attacks have happened inside the United States? And if so, can you give us some of the locations and details that you can share with us?
Yes, without a doubt, they have happened here in the United States. As I mentioned in my opening testimony, we know of quite a number, and I would say perhaps the majority of them were in the Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia area. There are also a number, particularly of FBI personnel down in Florida. I do know of some other locations of which I can tell you more about in a more private situation, not necessarily because of classification, but for privilege of the individual client not to reveal it. But there is no doubt there have been quite a number of cases here, particularly relating to the CIA. CIA and FBI most predominantly, also State Department.
There's another clip that Carla Turner talks about where she refers to what she calls my labs, military abductions. And anyway, one of the people being questioned on Capitol Hill about this was saying that the effect of psychotronic weaponry on the brain is it makes you think you're going insane, and you hear voices in your head. You see things that aren't there. You hallucinate things.
There's no entry or exit wound. How they're designed is to make the target feel like they're crazy, like they're imagining things, especially on the low duration, the low intensity, long duration hits.
But you were saying that the targets are most often always either CIA, FBI, intelligence, law enforcement individuals. Is that correct?
No, I said diplomats, intelligence community, and Department of Defense make up the lion's share. You often don't hear about the Department of Defense, despite DoD having 5 or 10 times the number of survivors that Department of State has.
Many of the hallmarks of what one might say are an abduction experience can be induced from a distance using some kind of electromagnetic tool, which further muddies the waters and makes it even more difficult to ascertain what, are these people being manipulated? Is something actually happening to them? And then you have cases like, someone like Terrence McKenna talking about DMT and the pineal gland and seeing machine elves when they have a hallucinogenic experience, and that's being reported a number of different times. Do you have any thoughts on the type of mental state that we're talking about here and the types of experiences that we're discussing? Could those be artificially induced, or could they be induced through hallucinogenic drugs? And could we misinterpret one for the other when we're looking at this? Does that make sense?
Yeah, great questions. There's two major questions there. Can they be induced, and could it be mistaken? Right. So the induction, yes. I know there's been research. I looked at some Russian research actually. It is around using out-of-body experiences and lucid dream techniques to induce alien encounters. So they go try inducing something that feels like an alien try to get in contact with aliens, report back what it is. And generally the narratives that come out are indistinguishable from abduction reports, except for the fact the person knows they're inducing that through a lucid dream intent experiment. So that's like one thing that I go from dream studies. Absolutely. Then there's the, it's derived a little bit from the Earthlights hypothesis we talked about, but this notion that the abduction event arises from electromagnetic disturbances in the brain. This is also, we know dream telepathy is impacted by geomagnetic stuff. So that makes sense to me from a different perspective. I go, okay, that hypothesis feels strong. They did some work with the God helmet to kind of prove out this experience. Like, can you induce these sorts of entity encounter type experiences? The God helmet was, it had like magnets or something, produce a huge magnetic field in the brain. People did have experiences with that. And then what you're saying around the Havana syndrome seems to make sense to me. So there is a sense of, yes, we can induce similar experiences. I got into Hellier, it was a series about Kentucky goblins where they induced an alien abduction belief system in someone through hypnosis. They believed it was unethical, and I'm just like so fascinated by that thing. So it's like, yeah, actually, we can induce these experiences. But so the question is, are they the real experience of alien encounter or whatever's underlying the abduction, or are they something different, right? So that's the question for me of discernment. And that's why I talk about the practice of like mindfulness, lucid dreaming, becoming skilled in multiple means of consciousness so that we have skilled observers that go, this induced experience was like this psychedelic, unlike this lucid dream thing, like this holotropic thing. And then we can start positioning those testimonies in a much richer matrix of understanding, instead of going like, aliens visited me. And then you go, well, how did it feel? And these, if they haven't trained in understanding their dreams or being sensitive to consciousness, we just get the report of like the content that comes out. And that can be, it's at this point, we don't have proof either way. So we're relying on people's testimony. If we can, however, induce these experiences, and then in turn induce some of the abduction phenomena like marks upon the body or teleportation, then we know that those experiences are in some way as valid or like distinct as the abduction event.
So let's expand out a little bit and talk about how do you when you work with people on a one-on-one basis and someone comes to you with their story, how do you come at this? Like, where do you begin with a person who says they've had an experience or a series of experiences? I just spoke with a gentleman the other day who I'm going to interview hopefully this week, and he claims to have had dozens and dozens and dozens of abductions over the course of his life. He says his parents had been taken. He said his whole family has been affected by this. And I asked him, because this was actually after you and I had our email exchange, and when I was on the phone with him, I said, it's so hard for someone who hasn't experienced this to understand that, you have to, my instinct is to ask questions like, what did it smell like? When you're on the ship, can you smell anything? What does it smell like? What does it feel? What's the texture of their skin? If you touch it, can you feel a texture? And he claims, he said, I bumped into one. I felt his physical body. I was standing behind one. I tripped. I've come forward and I bumped into him. He described the smell on board the craft. It smelled like ozone and some other musky smell I can't quite put my finger on, but it's just not a normal smell. And there's some details that come out that are very specific. When you talk to someone, do you hear very detailed things? And do you get information like that? And how does that fit into your assessment of what you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I would say anyone interested in an abduction should undergo hypnosis and do hypnosis themselves to someone else, right? And there's ways to do that, just so you get a sense as to how those memories and experiences can come into consciousness. So the doing of that is really effective. But when someone comes to me, I ask a lot of questions. We have an hour-long or 2-hour-long conversation about their experiences, about their history, about their beliefs, about their experience with dreams. And then I talk to them about how I do work. And so when I first started, I used a lot of the language around regression hypnosis. And I said, okay, this is how the abduction hypnotists use regression hypnosis. I think it's more dreamlike than memory. I think it's more shamanic dream work than memory. So I build a bridge, and some of my training in hypnosis was from an organization. It's in depth hypnosis. It uses shamanism and Western hypnotherapy techniques. So that's a really strong bridge for me. So then I get them to conceptually agree, and they have to agree in my terms of service that they understand it's not memory retrieval. They have to agree they understand this is a spiritual practice of basically dream shamanism. So then I explain we may have an experience that responds to the intention that may produce insight or understanding about the missing time, but it may not. So we get really clear as to the intention as to why someone's working with it. Generally, they work with me and their experiences not for the purpose of producing testimony, but for the purpose of reducing anxiety and stress they're feeling. They go, how is this even possible? I had this experience. I'm missing this time. My clothes were on backwards. I had this body mark. I saw this UFO. How is that possible? And they run on this hamster wheel in their mind until they go, I don't remember that. I need to remember that. And then they talk to me, and then we work together to have a dream experience that addresses that emotional tension. Sometimes they remember, and so they use the term memory. And sometimes they have an experience that's clearly dreamlike, but somehow resolves the emotional tension and gives them insight, but it might not be testimony. So that's how I respond to them. So in this case, with the strong details and things like that, I would be curious about past experiences of hypnosis. I would explore in hypnosis how this person perceives things. Like I say, in the dream world, everyone perceives things differently. So too in hypnosis. So you might see things really well, or hear them or feel them. And I have a methodology I go through to build a rapport with your skills, your unique beingness in that world. So then we get really clear, okay, you're not a detailed-oriented person. You smell a lot of truth, but you don't see a lot in the experience, and that's totally fine. So it's sort of this like personalized understanding is how I respond to it. And it doesn't produce a lot of the stuff that abduction researchers produce. They just can't. But I feel that those stories are still very, very meaningful and could be so very impactful if we were to study and look into them.
And just to be clear, are you suggesting that, and again, I'm not trying to like pin you down on this too hard. I just want to get your perspective, but are you suggesting that all of the hypnotic work that had been done on abductees or contactees or experiences, whichever term you feel most comfortable with, for decades, that work is that useless to us because of the inherent problems with memory and hypnosis, or is it helpful but not reliable? Or how would you categorize all this vast amount of information that we seem to have from hundreds and hundreds of cases that have been looked at? Should we set all that aside and say that there's, we need better tools to look at this, or is there something there that we can pull from this?
I love that question. I'm just getting to the answer around this because I've been sort of triggered in my exploration around the hypnosis and dream stuff. I look through David Jacobs and I go, oh my God. Or like a Bud Hopkins, oh my God, they had no idea about dreams or hypnosis. They're doing it so bad. They're implanting false memories and it's like almost traumatic and harmful. That's where I'm at. And then I keep looking through the actual things they say and that sense of all of them go, reality is happening here. Something very real is happening here. So my understanding now is that the entire body of hypnosis testimony, even the stuff I produce, is questionable in terms of historic testimony. As a historic record of events that may be corroborated by evidence of like UFO sightings or footprints or whatever, all of that is questionable. That's what I'm saying. But I'm also saying that now, since we're questioning it, it actually looks like dream testimony to me. And as dream testimony, I go, this is actually dream testimony because it was derived from something that was known to induce dreams, right? Like hypnosis is known to induce dreams or dreamlike experiences. We know that from science. So it looks like dream testimony to me. That's associated with extraordinary physical effects. And therefore, instead of throwing out David Jacobs as like in the worst characterization of him, he is an unethical kind of pervert using hypnosis for unconscious perpetration of whatever. I go, no, that's an inaccurate characterization, even though sometimes I've fallen into that with him. He actually would produce a tremendous amount of testimony that's tremendously interesting about these encounters that we need to go through a personal and collective discernment process with. So I think about the example of, I have a whole tote of dream journals, like dozens of dream journals every night for years or whatever. And those are not records of historic events. And some of those have true prophecies about the future. And some of those have true interactions with beings that may be on another planet in space, beaming the dreams to me. And some of those are my personal embarrassing wish fulfillment dreams. And they're all just mixed together in those books. And I don't have time to go through them. And that's sort of where we're at, where I move with them every time I move this huge tote of stuff. And so I think that's where we're at with the abduction literature. And that's why I'm talking about it. That's why I'm so excited about the capacity to do this research in an accredited PhD program. I'm like, we can actually look into that testimony, start interpreting it and saying, what do these dreams that Hopkins, David Jacobs, and Matt collected, what do they say actually about contact and these anomalous physical effects that are pretty well documented and sort of undeniable if you start getting into this world? I hope that was clear. Is that clear?
It more or less. I think it's hard for some people because, it depends on everyone who comes into this is coming into it from a different perspective and at different points in their lives. And like you said, there seems to be a sense of mission attached to this quest to understand UFOs and NHI and UAPs and all this. Kelly Chase talked about it. I have it. I had an experience and it just like flipped a switch for me. And I was like, this is something I have to start doing. Which I can't help but connect it to something that David Jacobs talks about, which is that there seems to be, he said he's talked to hundreds of people, and not every, but many of the people he talked to report there's a plan. There's some kind of thing that people say they are supposed to do.
This is a serious situation. I look at this and I think to myself, I don't think that my sons are going to be living the lives that they think they're going to be living. I fear for the future. I never would have imagined myself saying something like that some years back, but now I have no choice. The evidence is overwhelming. It's sort of mind-boggling that this is happening and that it's headed towards something. They're not doing this because they're experimenting on us or anything like that. This is headed towards what I would imagine to be a major event where they will suddenly take over the Earth for reasons that we do not know.
Well, this brings us to the change, and you've written about this, and I wonder, we've got about 10 minutes remaining here. Can you talk about what is this change? You got this phrase from a number of your folks. What can you say about this?
People began to tell me that the aliens were telling them that soon there was going to be a change. The change was coming. Everybody was going to know his place. It was going to be wonderful. The change is coming. The change will be. And I always wondered what the change was. Mm-hmm. And I would ask abductees, well, what is the change? They must have told you what the change is going to be. Nobody knew. And if you think if this were psychological, well, everybody would know, and it might be different for every person, but they would say, well, the change is when this, that, whatever. Mm-hmm. But nobody knew. So, and let me just say also that nobody was aware that other people were saying that, obviously. Right. When I began to understand that these aliens were now coming down to Earth and beginning to live here, then I began to realize that the change was that this was, in fact, a takeover situation, and that the change for these aliens was that the Earth would be changed because they would then be in control. That's my best guess. And they would be living here, and they couldn't care less about the ones who are normal humans. They've got their own humans that they've been making, so to speak. But whatever it is, this planet will be theirs, I think. That's my best guess. They've been doing this for a long time. There's a reason for it. It's not just because they like examining humans. No. There's a reason for it. Mm. They are working towards this change of people who will be living here, I think. That's my best guess.
I've actually wondered that this would be actually an ideal society for them to conquer or to take over if they wanted. We're just on the verge of developing, implementing worldwide 5G smart device technology where every device is talking to every other device. The ability for a complete 24/7 surveillance into everyone's home is a reality. And just imagine hijacking that kind of infrastructure.
And then he would go, okay, well, what is it? And they'd go, I don't know. That's the part I can't get at. John Lear talked about it.
And these people who have been abducted, and there's probably over 100,000 of them, have been given some place to go and something to do. But under our best hypnotic techniques, we cannot find out what it is.
So how do we know that that's true?
Because they said they're going to do something. They know that they're going to do something, but under the hypnosis, they can't find out exactly what it is.
So I find that really interesting because it certainly felt that way for me, but my experience wasn't a typical contact or abduction experience in the sense of a traditional UFO narrative. I had an experience on psychedelics during an ayahuasca ceremony in Peru where I had a precognition event that years later happened, and it sealed the deal for me. So I was given information, and I actually, the experience that I had was, as the ayahuasca took effect, it was almost, I describe it as someone takes a fader knob and just turns it, and the real world as we feel it just faded out, and it faded up this other world. And I was in the same spot. I was in this different space, and on the beings there were different, but they were real. Information was coming into my brain in the form of downloads. I would get complete, total 360-degree understanding about questions I had, concepts I was trying to understand, things that I didn't know that I wanted the answers to. I would get the answer to the question. I would get the reason why I came up with the question. I would get the experience of the emotions felt by the person I was talking to in the room 2 years ago when I had the thing that made me want to ask the question in the first place. I could feel it from their shoes as if I was talking to them. And I had a lot of this. And so I think I've lost my thread now. I just went into a huge circle. But I guess it boils down to, is this something that, going back to what we said about inducing it, when someone takes a powerful psychedelic in the proper way and they've prepared adequately for it and they know what they're getting into and they do it in the correct setting and with the right procedure, is this reliable? Can they go to this place? Can they go wherever we're talking about, this plane, and gather information, communicate with beings like Robert Monroe talks about in his book, Out of Body, and then come back and bring useful information back? And can that be done reliably? Could we do it next Wednesday at 3:13 in the afternoon, or could we do it 2 weeks from now? You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. That's a great question. The sense of going out and coming back and inducing it reliably through psychedelics. The one thing I will note is that in literature, there's a psychedelic researcher who have observed that mantis beings, insectoids, are present in both DMT literature reports and abduction reports. They were not connected by anyone for a decade or two. So the sense here is that it is actually going to a space or with beings that seem to be able to act through psychedelic spaces as well as abduction experiences that would give a sense of, yeah, actually we're inducing something real. Now, the sense of being able to prove that or reliably do that requires a sense of what are we even talking about? So is this scientific validity or spiritual validity? So this is something I keep thinking about in terms of the hypnosis event, right? Because the regression event as historic memory is not meaningful unless the hypnotist can reproduce the retrieval of memory in subjects that are not abductees, right? And I haven't done that myself. My clients are terrible at remembering what day of the week it is, even if I hypnotize them to or whatever. So it's something else is going on with that, but people keep doing hypnosis and they find meaning in it. So what is that level of validity? The same thing with psi phenomena like precognition or whatever. The ability to prove that, there's little hints, right, in the statistics. They go, this is way more than chance, but not enough to be seen with the physical, macroscopic eyes. So we have to get clear as to that validity test. For me, one of the things you said was the sense of mission, which you connected to David Jacobs, which is interesting to me because David Jacobs has this sort of paranoia around the mission. So why are you so comfortable in acting out that mission, right, is a question. Yeah,
I think, and to be fair, I don't know that David Jacobs is when he talks about the sense of mission, there is an ominous undertone there, as if there's like a plan that has a beginning, a middle, and we are approaching the end of whatever that plan is. And when it happens, there's going to be a thing, and it's going to take place, and we're all going to know. At least that's the way he kind of describes it. And I'm kind of paraphrasing what Kelly Chase said in that interview that she and I did, but she described it almost like being a sleeper agent that's activated. Like you have an experience and it just makes you go, wait a second. Why am I going to work in a cubicle every day? Like, what is, whoa, something is not, the reality is way bigger than we think it is. And I have to do something about that. I need to talk about it, communicate it, talk to people, investigate it. There's almost like seems like people get bit by this bug and then they just fall down the research hole for like a year and they just read everything about it and they become steeped in the topic. And then they just try to like find their way through. And I think that's where a lot of people in our audience are. You know, this has come across their radar and now they're just like, well, what do I do with all this? Like, where does it go? Yep. You know, we know that if we can believe the testimony that we've heard from so many well-credentialed, highly credentialed, well-positioned people in our government, intelligence agencies and elsewhere, including admirals and former presidents. And I mean, there are real physical craft as real as the nose on your face, and they are in a building somewhere. We can go there. And we have it on very high confidence that consciousness is involved somehow in the operation of these craft, which suggests, at least to me and many others, that consciousness represents some fundamental fabric of reality that there is a technology that can be built around to take advantage of. And we have maybe missed that branch on the technology tree. So I wonder if, in your assessment of how you bring this in, you talk a lot about dream shamanism. I'm wondering if you can define that a little more clearly for the audience, and then talk about some of the physical things that David Grush, for example, and others have talked about, seeing physical real craft or reporting that this is being worked on in our government or some classified way. Are those physical craft part of the world as you're seeing it, describing it through D-SETI?
Yeah, they were very much for me for a long time. I loved.
I'm sorry if I keep coming back to this, but I'm still trying to like understand where the boundaries of this are of D-SETI and how everything fits into it.
Yeah, same here. So when I started D-SETI, I wrote all about David Grush, 2017 articles. I was like, the world is changing. I said exactly what you said around reality of craft, right? So for me, it has shifted in terms of how I think about this, tracking the activity of Robert Bigelow from 1991 to now. So I think
he's a strange one, right? He's in all of this stuff.
He's in all of it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I asked about the connection between body marks and abduction. Like, when did this happen? And that's where I got to the Unusual Personal Experiences booklet. He funded it. Him and the Prince of Liechtenstein, $200,000. It's like 1 million times more money than what Thomas Bullard made. That was the last time abduction research was funded. It's like nuts because he pushed it so very hard in the early 90s and then created National Institute for Discovery Science. And then his work was written about in the 2017 article. And then the Kona Blue stuff, right? That's all his organization. So every bit of claim we have publicly about craft is influenced by Bigelow in some way, shape, or form, and comes through lenses that are impacted by him. So that's the insight I have from tracking the literature between Unusual Personal Experiences all the way to Kona Blue and the disclosure narrative. So I go, the disclosure narrative is the shadow or impact of Robert Bigelow in this world. That's my hypothesis in terms of literature. I would love to be proved otherwise, but like, that's what it looks like to me. And for me, it looks like he has an interview on Joe Rogan where he talks about silly dreams of little men in his room, and then thinking that perhaps it's abduction, but talking to Hopkins, Jacobs, and Mack and deciding better not go down that route because that's probably abduction. I'm going to block off those dreams. And so I think he's stuck in like I talked about the fascination avoidance cycle or this rabbit hole thing. he's stuck in a rabbit hole that would be alleviated if he were to just remove that block he's put in because of Hopkins, Jacob, and Mac. So,
yeah, I think I get what you're saying. He did recently an interview. Do you watch Jeffrey Mishlov's New Thinking Aloud channel? Did you ever see that interview he did with Jeffrey Mishlove on the after death? Does consciousness continue after death? He funded that study recently. There was a competition, I think it was, to put together, and Jeffrey Mishlove won the competition, if I understand right. So again, you have a guy who goes on and talks about, he says he knows these beings are real for a fact. He says, I know they're real. And then it gets even weirder because he goes, some of them look just like us. You couldn't tell the difference if you were sitting next to them in a restaurant.
Yep.
And here, this guy's a billionaire. He owns an aerospace company. He's a genius. He's clearly a very, very intelligent man who has the funds to study all this. He started NIDS, like you said. He was one of the early guys working all the way back into the 80s and 70s. Russell Targ, Hal Puthoff. Some of these folks, it all comes back to consciousness. No matter how many times you go around this loop or how you come at it, it always leads back to this idea that there's something fundamental about consciousness that we are getting wrong. And that's why we're not able to wrap our minds around this. And so I think it's just really, it's interesting that you zeroed in on him, because I've always had that question too about Bigelow. He's like, what's going on with this guy? He's so clear about it, you know?
The sense of clarity there, like there's something real happening. Abduction is so much that he funds it a lot, NIDS, all of that, right? And so the question for me is, if Bigelow did not block away those silly dreams, if he went through a complete process of inquiry with abduction, right? And abduction, instead of blocking it away, if he went through that completely, would he be as convinced about the physical reality of the craft and being? Or would he be more open to kind of ambiguous interpretation? So for example, we talked about Bud Hopkins and Kathy Davis, his major experiencer. Kathy Davis goes, I saw a blob of light. I have body marks. I teleported. I saw a being. I don't know if that's a spacecraft. I don't know if that's abduction. I don't know if that's surgery. And I don't know if that's an alien. So the intuition here is Bigelow might be in the same spot Hopkins was regarding all of these things. And that if he were to unblock those silly dreams or avoidance of it, he might move into this space where Kathy Davis, the experiencer, is saying something really happened. I don't know what it is. And so for me, I think, well, I know that dream researchers have observed the precedent of apports, meaning the teleportation of physical objects from dreams to waking phase. And go, what if all the UFO craft and bodies are just tricks of the dream where they've manifested something that looks like spacecraft to us that will give us a sense of mission, move us forward, but they didn't come here in spacecraft. They are always here based in consciousness, and that interaction perhaps between Bigelow, our military industrial complex, and all those who are touched by his research created scenarios where these UFO craft, which aren't actually spacecraft from a different planet, but are assemblages of inspirational technology, oozed itself from the dreaming realm into the physical realm for us to be able to capture little bits and pieces of inspiration in this realm. And so
is that what you're proposing? That's what you're suggesting is going on?
That's one of my major hypotheses. Yeah.
I see.
So to test it, I need to teleport through dreams, bring about some metamaterial.
Produce a craft. Sure.
Right? Produce a craft. But I've already produced geometric body marks that I found in patterns across experiencers, disconnected across decades and countries. And it's the same geometry, same pattern of dreamlike interaction with Paul Gray. Like, oh my God, right? Like, and I had that mark on my body. I found documentation outside of my body with other experiencers who equally were like, what are these dots in a line? They seem geometrically proportioned. I had this weird dream. And so I did that through dream incubation experiments that took 6 months. I was open to it or whatever, but something actually happened that was miraculous. And so I think that's a good start. Like next step for me is like lights in the sky manifestation. And that's like CE5 already does that. And then beyond that is sort of a kind of a teleportation phenomena. We'll see how that goes. I mean, all of this requires a lot of work to do.
Yeah, it's a time thing. And it's a lot of work. Even just to get up to speed with what we think we know. That's which is so frustrating because we don't even know what we really know. And what we think we know, we don't know how real that is. It's hard. It's very hard. Have you looked at Chris Bledsoe's case at all? He's probably the most famous recent case. You've looked at this?
So I looked at it deeply because Dan Berg, my first client, right? He is an experiencer. He's public, right? So the Chris Bledsoe's, like, I guess, manager, David Broadwell, who helped write the book UFO of God, organizes his media tours, gave him media training, organized the Monroe Institute UAP Consciousness Contact event that brought together academics, government scientists, and experiencers. It brought Dan Berg into the mix. So he went off to the Monroe Institute so very excited and had an interaction with Chris Bledsoe or whatever, and came back and had this sort of aftermath experience. It was like disillusioning to him. And it turned out he was like, he turned out to be the skeptic in the end of the book UFO of God. Have you read it? Are you aware of that encounter?
I haven't read UFO of God. I've just watched all of the interviews I can find with him. And in particular, who was it? It was Richard Dolan did a 3-part interview on his show with Bledsoe. And I just thought, for those who don't know, and I just to pause here real quick and just give a quick 30-second recap of what supposedly happened to Chris Bledsoe, for people who haven't followed this. He's a person who was, I forget when his experiences happened, but they weren't that long ago, historically, but he was a regular guy in the Carolinas. He had some debilitating health issues, and he went on a camping trip with his son and 2 guys who worked for him, and they went fishing. And they all, as a group, saw orbs, a bunch of orange lights that appeared suddenly where they were. They experienced missing time. He reported having contact with a being that he called the Lady, which has been reported by a number of different people that appeared as a glowing blonde woman in a robe that was hovering above the ground, and she gave him an object, and he had this thing in his hands. He describes holding it and then dropping it because he was freaked out by it. And then he was supposedly cured of his, I forget what the condition was. But it's a really weird case. And he's so specific about a lot of these details. But then it's like, well, where's the thing you dropped? Where the thing they gave you? Where did you put that? Did you not? And it just vanishes from the story and no one talks about it again. Some very weird things there. And I just wonder, what you make of Bledsoe's story.
Yeah, there's one observation I need to make by way of documentation, and then I think he's one of the most fascinating stories, and his story expresses this paradox we've been dancing around of dream reality. Is it true? Is it fiction? I think
he had so many other people with him that night. There were like 3 people with him that saw this.
Yeah. So one of the things, Dan Berg's experience in Monroe Institute, it was filmed by, they had government scientists studying Bledsoe, and they used the CE5 initiation or invocation. So they started work, they did a skywatch to see, can we invoke UFOs? In the experience, my buddy Dan Berg is like, no, that's actually a satellite. And he's like, no, this is an orb. He goes, no, that's actually a blinking light. No, that's an orb. And so they had this conflict that was written about in the last episode of the UFO of God book. And at the end of it, what ended up happening is Dan says, hey, I'm sorry for calling. Basically, you can't tell the difference between satellites and UFOs. I'll trust you. Sure, it's an orb. I'm sorry. And then at that moment, there was a blinking light that came out, and it was filmed by Rob Freeman. And Chris wrote in the book, it's the UFO. It's God showing him that UFOs are real and stuff like that. Rob Freeman had the director of MUFON Canada kind of do an analysis. he says it's definitely a UAP. And I thought, okay, it's blinking. So I thought, oh, it seems like an actual UFO communication to me, right? A UFO communication, that's what it looks like. So I spent probably 80 hours analyzing this blinking light, going, okay, it's pulsating in a way. How do I get that data from? I built some software to do that, to pull out data from blinking lights. I do that now. Oh, I've done that a lot with dozens of other craft and stuff like that. And I find that the pattern is basically a geosynchronous satellite. And I get confirmation from a space scientist. It is geosynchronous. Didn't stop me. I mean, I spent months believing it was like a geometric communication. And so for me, that tells me there wasn't discernment in the scientist team around him, MUFON or Chris Bledsoe, as to whether or not something's an orb or prosaically explained. So that's one bit of information I have around that. And I've analyzed other footage, and it has the same thing. But that's not problematic in terms of my belief in the phenomena, because Chris goes, they mimic these things, right? And there's other reports of mimicking. So there's this whole sense of, is something really happening, or is it just misidentification? But if it is misidentification, there's so many weird synchronies around it. Like, how is it even possible that 12 people, like 3 academics, 3 experiencers, government people, and Chris Bledsoe can come together, have these experiences, and be fooled by a geosynchronous satellite? Like, how is that even possible? So,
and some of the people in Chris Bledsoe's orbit are like Jim Semivan, the CIA officer who's now retired but studies this. These are people of very high esteem and clearly know the difference between a satellite and an orb. I mean, observationally, they're trained observers, intelligence people who should know anyway.
Oh, yeah. And they consulted with people who should know. So either someone's lying about it to us, or they don't actually care about high flying blinking lights, that they actually just care about the local orbs that show up. That was another thing that came out of there. And so I started looking at Chris's experience with local orbs, and there's some footage around it, but one of the things that I find most compelling is he directed the Discovery Channel to reproduce that orb sighting, right? And so he said, no, it was like, they're bigger, they're smaller. And he worked with the computer animators to show what it looked like. And that's this, and I started analyzing all the geometry of UFOs I could see, similar to that blinking light. And I found, hey, actually his orbs are geometrically almost identical to some Phoenix Lights orbs. And these are identical to the celestial phenomena over Nuremberg print. And these are identical to orbs in petroglyphs that clearly are summoned by shaman in the petroglyph. They call it the meteor shaman. And so there's these references of these geometrically aligned orbs. Chris directed it based on his missing time thing. So I go, wow, there's so much proof that there's not like high flying UFOs, but there's something like a UFO thing that imprints itself on him. He can experience it. And yet there's paradoxes and confusion. And is it a satellite? Is it not? But something really is happening. And so I look to him as a really wonderful example of an experiencer that's surrounded by this paradox and has confusing things and illusions. And this is a very good example of dream interpretation at work, right? So we have personal imagination and something beyond that. And so how to navigate that, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a skeptic. I believe some of the fact that it was a satellite is proof of something. And I mean, for me personally, even in that discovery, right, that satellite, the only precedent I could find in literature for a long time was a satellite named Raguda, who was the Russian dream researcher that emulated alien encounters. And so there's this whole synchronicity journey for me around that too. And I think kind of we're there in culture as well, this sense of, wow, there's a lot of meaning here. How do we even put it together on the table and make sense of it? Because the notion like the lady is flying around in a spacecraft that's blinking isn't accurate, but these live orbs that can imprint themselves on someone else's consciousness, move in these geometric patterns, is real. So how do you make sense of that?
Yeah, I think it's hard to pin down, because the on the one hand, it's possible. I think it's completely possible that we have some type of advanced psychotronic weaponry that could even be satellite based, where you could target an individual from space and you could hit them with a pulsed beam of some kind that could cause them to think that all kinds of things are happening. And you could give them a crazy experience. And then they just were, oh yeah, I was talking to this woman and she gave me this information or whatever. And of course, like, you'd want to study that on people. Our own government, the Tuskegee experiments, we've done all kinds of stuff with people in the past that was just super classified. They didn't tell anybody, and they did experiments on regular people. It's totally possible that a number of people who claim to have been abducted have been exposed to some kind of bizarre technology. And maybe that's domestic, or that's ours. And maybe that's what's going on. I want to zoom out a little bit, and we're so tight on time. How are you on time, by the way?
Oh, I'm fine. I love these conversations.
I do too. I lose track of time, and we could just keep going. But do you, just zooming out from this whole conversation into the discussion about contact in general, broadly speaking, since 2017, we've seen this, what appears to be an acceleration of interest, momentum, focus, academic expertise being leveled on this topic. Are we being visited? If so, what's going on? You know, we're seeing the Soul Foundation. We've got Chris Mellon giving presentations. We've got retired admirals. You know, expertise. Gary Nolan. All these other people. Do you get the sense that this is just more of the same conversation we've been having for 50, 75 years, and we're just in a new phase of it where we're just looking at it differently? Or do you get the sense that this is building to some sort of climax and there is an end to this, where there's going to be, we hear talk occasionally from different people about some kind of event that they expect to happen? Maybe a contact event, maybe something big where a ship shows up above Central Park and stays there for a week. What's your sense as a researcher and someone who looks at this intensely? Do you sense that this is a cultural phenomenon, or is there something real that is building towards some kind of event?
It's a really good question. The sense I have around if it's building, yes, it seems like it's building. I mean, in terms of who's building it is a question for me. And one of the things I observe is, you know, the impact of the 2017 article, right? Like, there is this sort of momentum now of people taking it seriously. And I had so many people call me and say, the 2017 article inspired me to look back and my experiences in the 1990s or 10 years ago, just kind of make sense of them. Now that other people are taking it seriously, I need to take this seriously, is what they've said. So I've seen this sort of movement and a potential. And I'm really hopeful now that people are talking about it. Now, what it's building to, I'm not quite sure. Is it an event like protecting us from solar flares or flipping of magnets or whatever, or like alien takeover? I'm not sure. And so the answer or the response to that I'll give is an observation of worldviews. So Western worldview is characterized by linear time. Eastern worldview is characterized by circular time. So, or maybe indigenous as well. But there's this sense of repeated cycles. There's this sense of maybe there's no beginning, middle, and end. It's perpetually primordially there. And so the difference between like Christianity with its notion of salvation and end of the world sort of thing, and Buddhism with this sort of progressive, cyclical building towards an enlightenment that isn't actually like an event that happens in time, because in the moment of enlightenment, you project your enlightened self backwards and forwards in time, and you have this emanation body. And so there's something that happens in that moment. So I say this notion around building to an event or an end time has mythological resonances with Western worldview. And so I think, the sense that we're building to a catastrophic disclosure event, or an event that needs to change something, is a retelling of Western mythology and our focus on the end time and our focus on progression. Now, I know that mythologies represent true and untrue aspects of the world, and that different worldviews have different parts of it. So it's probably something like we're building towards something and there's something cyclical around it. For me, I think of the event like a singularity event. So like I said, with dealing with the physical bodies of time-traveling psychic space aliens would not render a regression. It would render a telepathic communion. So too, I think this sense of building towards disclosure or whatever, we build anti-gravity craft in the wake of exploring UFO craft or whatever. We develop these skills of moving backwards and forwards in time, something like that. Then we break out of historic time, linear time, in a way that would be catastrophic to that entity or individual or identity stuck within that linear time. So there's a very strong truth that it's world ending, that we'll enter into a different world. But from that perspective, that's always eternal or cyclical or whatever. It may be a sense of return to a more natural state of being, which I feel is lost sometimes in our focus around technological progression. I hope that responded to your question. Do you have a sense as to what you believe around where we're headed?
I don't know what to think, and I think that's where I'm most comfortable being. I like to ask these questions because I don't think I don't know that any one person has enough pieces, but I think enough people have a piece of the puzzle that if I eventually if I talk to enough people, I'm going to kind of suss out. I try to look for overlap and try to find the common themes, and I think the common themes that I've uncovered so far seem to be pretty general, but enough that there's a paradigm shift implied there, that the consciousness is fundamental. Our understanding of the way that reality works omits a lot. We probably see maybe less than 1% of what's actually happening in the real universe around us, the real space. And our brain is filtering out much more than it's doing in anything else. It's just kind of omitting a lot of those things so that we can focus on the narrow band of existence that we're in. I've had personal experiences that have reinforced that for me and made me question it. And I wonder how much of it is, broadly speaking, of just people in general, brought on by the heightened level of generational anxiety that we seem to be feeling in the sort of the zeitgeist around some very scary facts that we can see with our own eyes. The ecological catastrophe that's unfolding daily around us, like the climate systems of this planet are in free fall. We're experiencing the sixth great mass extinction right now. We're in an extinction event right now as we're talking. If there was ever a time for beings to show up and pay attention to what's happening here, this would be the most interesting time for sure. Clearly, there's I don't even know how many seconds we are from midnight from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, but the clock is ticking and we're closer to nuclear Armageddon than we've ever been. And you don't have to look far to see that within probably, if we haven't already done it, which it appears that we have. The researcher from Google, he's Egyptian, I can't recall his name, but he said that ChatGPT-4 has an IQ of 150. Einstein is 160. Since that interview came out, they introduced the new ChatGPT 4.0, I guess, which is now smarter than GPT-4 by a lot. And we might even see AGI within the next 12 months, if we don't already have it in some system somewhere, cordoned off. And I wonder how many of these how much of this is related? How much of this is related? Because if we're on the cusp of ecological collapse or nuclear conflagration or creating some kind of a super being, essentially building a god in a computer that can do anything and take control away from all of us, how does that affect what we think we're looking at vis-a-vis the UFO phenomenon? Are we seeing something for what it actually is? Beings coming here to communicate with us about something serious? Have they always been here and now is the time of crisis that we have to pull our shit together and figure out what to do as a species and decide what it is to be human and make some real serious decisions about that? Is this the time where we're supposed to unlock the latent abilities that are inherent in all of us to access higher levels of consciousness and deal in that realm? And do we need to begin the very real and serious process of training ourselves mentally and spiritually to compete and function on that level, because that's where the real action is? I don't know, but it seems like that. It's the sense that I get, and I can't avoid it, is that consciousness sort of in a way represents some kind of a psychic internet, that there is a cult, an enormous amount of civilizations at a certain point, they just evolve to a point where they have access to this. And it's like, we're still in the ocean. We haven't developed the ability to come out of the ocean onto land yet. And we have to nudge ourselves in that direction to where we can basically begin to access some of these abilities and communicate on their level. It's too big. It's almost like your mind strains to contain all of the possibilities. But I love the fact that there are so many possibilities and that it's opened the thinking of so many people. And I don't know. I think the most exciting thing I've seen recently was the group out of, I want to say it's Cambridge, that are doing studies on combining the methods of anesthesiology, modern medicine, with DMT, and doing a slow drip DMT over a period of time to send people into DMT hyperspace for extended periods to map the actual landscape there and come back with some kind of common understanding, like a psychonaut you could send over. And then when you go, do you meet beings? What are they like? If we send 100 people at the same time, are they all meeting the same beings? Does time work the same way? Are there rules to this world? Can we function there? Can we come? I think that's probably the cutting edge of all of this. And when all is said and done, we're going to have a completely new understanding of consciousness. But that's why I find it so exciting to talk to people like yourself, especially people who bring dreams into this and try to understand that complex relationship between experience and consciousness and the phenomenon in general. So I don't know what to think. I think that's the most exciting place to be.
Yeah. And, just to bring it back to the sense of possibility, and with dreaming too, it's really about the individual experience or the individual dreamer, and in the context of community. But we don't need to wait for any amount of disclosure to happen. That's in part one of the reasons why I'm raising some of my concerns around, do we have physical craft? Are they actually physical craft, or are they apports or something else? Because there's a sense sometimes of the UFO mysteries being locked away from people. And in part, I think they're here to inspire us to move towards them. They may actually just be a mirage that inspires us to move forward, which is why I think the New York Times article that focused on UAPs and less so on the paranormal really is a great metaphor for where we're at. It brings us in. The UFO goes, oh, this feels real. I can get inspired by it. Free energy technology. Let's do that. And then you go, well, maybe it's not as substantial as we thought, but maybe my powers of consciousness, given some time and effort and communication, might actually bring us together, or all of us together are working towards it in our simple way, right? Maybe that could really shift something. And so really giving a message of empowering people to go, if it is consciousness primary, then you are the primary investigator and subject of this phenomenon. That's the kind of ultimate message I would give.
There's or have you looked at Ingo Swann at all, or remote viewing, any of that stuff?
Just a little, yeah.
I just finished his book Penetration, and it was very chilling because for those who don't know, Ingo Swann is considered sort of like the father of remote viewing. He's like one of the most famous remote viewers. He was studied at Stanford Research Institute with Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. They're the ones who sort of started this whole line of inquiry into remote viewing, or the ability to see information and non-locally and project your mind or project yourself out to a different location and bring back intelligence. And then that intelligence could be put together as part of a tableau of information from other intelligence resources. And then they could basically build a more robust picture of what's going on. And in his book, he describes a lot of the research they did at Stanford Research Institute one case of where they had a quark detector that was buried in the floor of this building that he was able to access mentally and switch it off. He was able to describe what it looked like and draw it, even though it was buried under concrete and he didn't know what room it was in. He was able to sketch this out. And in his book, he talks about they were so bored doing repetitive experiments that one day they decided to just do something weird and just see, could he go to the moon? Could you go to the moon, or what could you access there? And he said he was able to go there, and not only did he see structures on the moon, he saw activity, he saw ships, he saw beings, and he said that he was convinced through contact he had with a number of other government intelligence type people that there was the moon represented some base of operations for something that was taking place here on Earth, and that they were using some kind of technology. There was a technology that could actually affect our thoughts and change the way that what we think about. And make us avoid certain things or dissuade us from thinking about this. And almost like in They Live, that movie They Live, where there's these subliminal messages that are sort of broadcast into people's minds. And I always found that really fascinating. So that book was a kind of an eye-opener. And just because of his background and the other things that he has been known to do, those claims are very astonishing to me. So yeah, it's a very... the rabbit hole just keeps going. There's no end to it. Is there anything else that we haven't covered? I feel like we've covered so much. What haven't we talked about that you'd like to get into before we wrap for today?
I think we covered almost everything I wanted to talk about. Thank you for having this conversation. It's been such a pleasure to talk about this. I do want to just say briefly to anyone in the audience, I know because my perspective says abduction is dreamlike. I want to take extra care to just say, I'm not trying to offend people or say your experience isn't real. You've had this question, what are you saying? And I'm actually saying that the lived experience of abduction is worthwhile to testify about and worthwhile to investigate, and that it's not anything to be embarrassed about, that there is a sense of mistaking dreamlike things for reality, because that's how it's a real communication, and that there's probably no underlying reality all the way down, like it's screen memories up and down, because it's consciousness based. And so that's how we have to perceive things, is through the initial communications that we receive them. And so in this way, I'm saying that there isn't any need to feel a sense of oh, I got it wrong because of the dream thing, or that the testimony is wrong or inaccurate. It just contextualizes it. And my ultimate hope is to make some cracks in the skeptical scientific mainstream worldview to receive this testimony a little bit more and consider what really is going on. So I did want to say that to leave with a sense of clarity around that.
So to be clear, you aliens are real in your perspective, like in the sense that we are trying to think about them as not us, something else, probably a lot smarter than we are, interacting with us. But what you're saying is it's not necessarily through physical day-to-day waking reality the way that we think of it. It might be interaction that's happening through the dream state. And so therefore there's some other methodologies we have to apply to deal with that and understand it. Is that accurate or close enough?
Yeah, just like Bud Hopkins concluded, hey, that blob of light was a spaceship. And Kathy Davis said, nope, it was a blob of light. I don't know what it is. I'm saying that the sense of dreaming, that dream narrative, brings us to that sense of what Kathy had. I don't know what it is, but there's a blob of light. And that when we talk about it in the context of dream studies and acknowledging the false memory syndrome and the hypnosis stuff, that gives us the ability to say what the phenomena we were actually experiencing, how that came into consciousness, that can give us much more clues. But ultimately, I'm saying there are ontologically distinct others who enact in our world that have anomalous physical manifestations like teleportation or body marks or genetic harvest. Like that's still not off the table in terms of my skepticism meter, right? I talk to people with genetic harvest symptoms and medical documentation and these dreamlike stories. So that tells me, wow, maybe we could become skilled psychic surgeons, not necessarily that zeta reticulans are stealing the eggs and sperm or something like that. I also go like, where are they teleporting it to? Where is it coming back? Like the apport phenomena. And so there's a whole bunch of questions, but ultimately the distinction between the ET hypothesis as naively put forward by the abduction hypothesis researchers and what I'm putting forward says, one says you're a powerless victim and we can't know about it. The other says you might not be a powerless victim and you might have the capacity to shift recurrent experiences and get insight and understanding around it and negotiate your relationship with those aliens or others, which ultimately I think is what my mission is to share that bit of information. Like, hey, this could be empowering if it's consciousness based.
Daniel, I'm so excited that we were able to pull this together in such short order and that we got into contact. Thank you so much for reaching out to me. This has been a truly fascinating conversation, and it's really exciting to see someone looking at this professionally with an academic mindset, bringing that type of rigor to this and proposing something new that I really had not been at all familiar with any of what we've talked about today prior to this conversation, except for our brief email exchange. And so this is really enlightening.
Thank you.
What would you tell people? What can they do? I've been contacted by a number of people who have claimed to have had abduction experiences, and they're looking for answers. They can't find anybody to talk to. I know one person has reached out to MUFON. They've reached out. They get nowhere. What would you advise someone to do if they have had an experience and they don't know what to do and they are just pulling their hair out?
Yeah, start thinking what they want to do with it. So there's two pathways I see. One is becoming a research subject. One is, and then the other is like integrating it like any other experience you have. So there's a private and public path. If you're called to a public path, I say generally there's corroborating witnesses, there's multiple footages, you have this sort of mission associated with it. I say follow that if you have that. If not, I would recommend staying private until you are called to talk about it publicly. I would also then recommend a practice of mindfulness in whatever way is meaningful to the experiencer, because there's the sense of abduction and the sense of unwanted abduction is very victimizing. There's a sense of trauma associated with it. There's a sense of confusion. So the thing for me, I know with recurrent nightmares, mindfulness helps shift it, meaning a meditation practice. Learning about nightmares also helps. So that's why I write so much about dreams and abduction, is because I'm hoping to help some of the experiencers out there who don't know how to shift it. There's books about it, right? There's some Christians wrote this book that if you pray to Jesus, you can stop abductions. Kathleen Martin wrote a book saying you're not powerless over abduction. There's some techniques to shift them. So I would recommend actually starting with her book, What to Do When You're Abducted. That has some good information around that. My work contextualizes that within dream studies. So I say the applications or interventions for sleep paralysis and nightmares would be helpful. And that's all around breath work, learning about those phenomena, changing postures. And then I've had really great success with myself and clients in working with them as if they were dreams, and as if dreams were real. So there's a two-step process of working with the Western biases around dreams that I say anyone needs to go in. They have to expand their understanding that dreams are meaningful and real. So that's removing the monophasic bias. And they also have to deal with, how do we interpret the dreamlike experience coming up? And the way of interpreting the hypnotic testimony or dreams, I say is, I looked at like Carl Jung's active imagination. He goes, treat it as if it's real within a specific context. So the abduction researchers treated the testimony as if it were real uniformly without bounds. And that's where we get to some of the absurdities associated with it. Like there's no physical proof in that way or whatever. But I say, treat those dreams as if they're real within specific contexts. That might be dream work sessions. That might be talking to people. So there's a lot of things there. I do offer DreamWork sessions and hypnosis sessions for experiencers. If people are like my voice or whatever perspective, they can contact me. I offer sessions by donation, free consultation. It's an hour or two. We talk about it, and then we do the sessions. And then after the fact, you write in what you want when you work with me. People don't. And if you like my voice, I also have an app, Dreamwell, that teaches mindfulness and sleep and dream stuff. But it's basically at that point, you are engaging in your own psycho-spiritual practice, meaning you engage the traditions that you grow up with, basically. That could be a religious tradition or a psychological tradition or a wisdom tradition, whatever. And that's how you engage with your dreams. And that's how I recommend engaging with your abduction experiences. I hope that was clear. Was that?
I think it was very clear. Okay. Yeah, and it seems like the common theme here is people need to become more, especially in America, much more, or in the West, more comfortable with engaging with your own consciousness in a sense, and like starting to take hold of that and take more active role in understanding it, engaging with it, using it. You know, it seems like we've done such a great job of separating our consciousness and what we're capable of as beings from our day-to-day life. And it's just, the more people can get in touch with that, all the greatest thinkers and wise people throughout history all want to, everybody you read about from Buddha to Jesus, they all want to go to a cave and get away from everybody and go sequester themselves away so that they could focus and access consciousness. I think there's some real fundamental truth there. And some positivity that we can all draw from. Where can people go to learn more about what you're up to and to get into direct contact with you if someone has questions and they want to work with you?
Yeah, D-SETI.org, D-SETI.org is the best place. I have an email address there. People can write to me. I also have a form to book a consultation, and that gives you all the information you need about the topics we talked about. I have books about that you can get to. They're on Amazon, they're on the website, and also the Dreamwell app, you can get there at the App or Play Store or dreamwellbewell.com. And that, I recommend that if you're an abductee and you want to learn about meditation and dreams, that's a great place to go, because that gives you the base level kind of understanding that's really based in research literature and stuff like that. But again, it's just D-SETI or Dreamwell.
Daniel, this has been an amazing conversation, truly enlightening. Thank you so much for carving out the time. I told you it would be maybe 2 hours, but we went way over. So this has been outstanding. I would love to have you back again. This is clearly a subject that we could talk for many more hours on. So it's far too much for one show, but hopefully we can set this up. You can come back and talk to us a little bit more.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.